Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, a quiet place where curiosity slows down, questions stretch their legs, and the long story of our planet is told gently enough to let your thoughts soften rather than race, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight. Whether the lights are low or the day is still lingering outside your window, I'm glad you're here. This is a space for wondering without urgency, for learning without pressure, and for drifting through ideas the way you might drift through a familiar landscape at dusk, noticing details without needing to name every single one. Tonight we're going to spend some time with a puzzle that sits quietly at the centre of human history, rarely announced loudly, yet always present once you notice it. It's not a mystery filled with explosions or secret codes. It doesn't rely on dramatic revelations or sudden twists. Instead, it exists as a silence, a long stretch where we expect to hear something, but don't. A pause so wide that it almost disappears into the background, even though it shouldn't. This is the lost age, the unexplained gap between prehistory and civilization. If you imagine human history as a long road, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, most of it is marked simply and sparsely. Stone tools, campfires, small groups moving through landscapes that were far less forgiving than the ones we know today. And then, rather suddenly, without much warning, the road changes. Permanent settlements appear, agriculture takes hold, monumental structures rise from the ground, writing emerges, mathematics, astronomy, organised religion, complex social hierarchies, all arrive in a relatively narrow window of time. The strange part is not that these things happened. The strange part is how little evidence we have of them learning to happen. There is no long, clearly visible apprenticeship period for civilization, no neat developmental sequence laid out in the archaeological record showing simple versions slowly becoming complex ones in a smooth, gradual way. Instead, many of the defining features of civilization appear abruptly, already functional, already sophisticated, already requiring planning, coordination, and knowledge that seems to come from somewhere just out of view. This doesn't mean something supernatural occurred. It doesn't require lost super technologies or vanished golden ages, at least not by default. But it does raise a calm, persistent question. What happened during the stretch of time we don't seem to be able to fully account for? As we move through this topic together, nothing here will ask you to accept extraordinary claims without evidence. At the same time, nothing will rush past the uncomfortable gaps simply because they are inconvenient. The goal isn't to replace one rigid story with another, but to slow down enough to notice where the story itself grows thin, where assumptions quietly stand in for missing information, and where the past may still be holding on to details we haven't learned how to read properly yet. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, just to ground us in the present moment before we wander too far into the deep past. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Not in any official sense, not according to atomic clocks or global standards, but in the personal sense. Is it late, early, somewhere in between? It's a small question, but fitting, given that so much of what we're about to explore depends on how humans relate to time, memory, and continuity. If you find this kind of exploration calming, intriguing, or simply a good way to unwind as the day releases its grip, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner of curiosity reach others who might enjoy a slower approach to big questions. There's no rush though. Everything we're talking about tonight has already waited thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. Now, let's ease into the story itself. For the vast majority of our existence as a species, humans lived in what we broadly call prehistory. This term doesn't mean nothing happened. It simply means there are no written records left behind to describe those events directly. What we know comes from bones, tools, dwellings, art, and the subtle marks left on landscapes by repeated use. It's a kind of history written without words, and it stretches back far further than most people realise. Modern humans, anatomically speaking, have been around for at least 300,000 years. During that time, we developed language, social bonds, symbolic thinking, and the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. We crossed continents. We adapted to deserts, forests, tundra, and coastlines. We survived ice ages. We painted cave walls. We buried our dead with care. None of this suggests simplicity or intellectual limitation. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, the material footprint of human societies changes very slowly. Stone tools improve, but incrementally. Shelters become more refined, but remain temporary. Food is gathered and hunted, not grown. Population sizes stay relatively small. Technology remains portable. Life is mobile, flexible, and deeply tied to local environments. There is ingenuity here, but it's focused on survival and adaptability rather than accumulation and permanence. Then, something shifts. Around 12,000 years ago, give or take depending on the region, humans in multiple parts of the world begin settling down. They start domesticating plants and animals. They build structures meant to last. They organise labour beyond the needs of a single family. They mark territory, define ownership, and develop systems for storing surplus. Within a few thousand years, writing appears. Formal mathematics emerges. Long-distance trade networks span continents. Monumental architecture rises, aligned with celestial cycles that require careful observation over long periods of time. In geological terms, this is almost instantaneous. The question is not why humans eventually built civilizations. Given our cognitive abilities, that outcome seems plausible. The question is why it happened so quickly, and why the preparatory steps are so difficult to trace. If you were to examine the development of most complex systems, biological or technological, you would expect to see a long runway. Early versions that are clumsy and inefficient. Numerous failed experiments. Gradual refinement. A visible learning curve. In many areas of human innovation, that's exactly what we find. But when it comes to the transition from mobile foraging societies to full-scale civilizations, the runway appears strangely short. This gap has been noticed for a long time, though it's often smoothed over in simplified timelines. Textbooks may describe a slow progression from hunter-gatherers to farmers, from villages to cities, from simple tools to complex machines. But when archaeologists look closely at the data, the transitions are often uneven, regionally inconsistent, and in some cases surprisingly abrupt. Take agriculture, for example. Farming is not an obvious or easy choice. It requires long-term planning, delayed gratification, detailed ecological knowledge, and the willingness to invest enormous effort for returns that are uncertain and seasonal. Early farmers worked harder, had less varied diets, and were more vulnerable to disease than many hunter-gatherers. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why did they adopt agriculture at all? And why did it spread so rapidly once it appeared? There are answers, of course. Climate stabilization after the last ice age, population pressures, local experimentation with wild plants. But even these explanations leave room for doubt. In several regions, domesticated crops appear suddenly in the archaeological record with little evidence of long-term experimentation. The wild ancestors of these plants exist, but the intermediate stages, the trial and error process that would logically lead from one to the other, are often sparse or missing. This pattern repeats in other areas. Stone architecture appears with unexpected sophistication. Sites like Gobekli Tepe, which we'll explore later, challenged long-held assumptions about the relationship between settlement, religion, and social organization. Writing systems emerge rapidly, already capable of expressing complex ideas. Astronomical alignments suggest careful observation of celestial cycles over generations, yet appear at sites that predate what we typically think of as advanced science. None of this implies a single lost civilization that ruled the world before disappearing. That idea is tempting because it feels tidy, but the reality is likely messier, quieter, and more difficult to reconstruct. The lost age may not be a single chapter torn from history. but a long uneven stretch of time where knowledge accumulated, fragmented, moved, and sometimes vanished without leaving the kinds of traces we're used to looking for. Part of the difficulty lies in preservation. Most human activity does not fossilize well. Wood rots, fibers decay, earthworks erode, coastal settlements drown as sea levels rise. Entire ways of life can disappear with barely a whisper in the geological record. If a society did not build in stone or leave behind durable markers, its absence may tell us very little about its actual complexity. There is also the issue of perspective. Archaeology is shaped by what we expect to find. For a long time, researchers assumed that monument building, symbolic art, and complex planning required agriculture and permanent settlements. When evidence contradicted that assumption, it was often dismissed or misunderstood. Only recently has there been a broader willingness to question linear models of progress and consider that human societies may have explored multiple paths, some of which did not lead directly to the civilizations we recognize today. This brings us back to the gap itself. Between the deep past of mobile human groups and the recognizable dawn of civilization lies a stretch of time that feels strangely underexplained. It's not empty, it's full of people, ideas, experiments and failures. But it doesn't resolve into a clean narrative. Instead, it appears as a mosaic with missing tiles, where patterns are hinted at but never fully revealed. Rather than trying to force that mosaic into a single image, we'll take our time moving through it slowly. We'll look at what we know, what we suspect, and what remains unresolved. We'll explore why the gap exists, not as a flaw in human history, but as a reminder of how much of the past operates beyond written memory. And as we continue, keep in mind that this story doesn't move toward a neat conclusion. It doesn't build to a final answer waiting at the end. Instead, it unfolds the way the past itself does, unevenly, with moments of clarity followed by long stretches of uncertainty. The goal isn't to arrive somewhere definitive, but to stay with the questions long enough that they stop feeling uncomfortable and start feeling familiar. Before writing was ever carved into clay or inked onto papyrus, long before dates could be pinned down and events arranged neatly into timelines, human life unfolded in a way that left very little behind for us to read directly. This is the stretch of time we call prehistory, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was recorded in ways that don't translate easily into words or numbers. It's a silence only in the sense that no one from that world is speaking to us directly anymore. The ground speaks instead, quietly, through stone, bone, ash, and soil, and it does so only when we learn how to listen patiently. For most of our existence as a species, this was the only way life was lived. Modern humans did not suddenly appear alongside cities, calendars, or organized states. We appeared as bodies first, then as minds, and only much later as record keepers. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens emerged at least 300,000 years ago. That number alone should slow us down for a moment. 300,000 years is difficult to imagine. It's long enough for entire mountain ranges to wear down, for coastlines to shift dramatically, for climates to swing between extremes multiple times over. And yet, within that enormous span, what we usually call civilization occupies only the most recent sliver. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived without agriculture, without permanent architecture, without writing, without metal tools. Still, they were not passive, primitive, or unaware. They adapted to a wide range of environments, from African savannas to frozen northern plains. They developed languages complex enough to coordinate group hunting, teach children survival skills and pass down stories. They formed social bonds, alliances, and likely traditions that lasted far longer than any modern institution. The difficulty we face today is that most of this activity leaves very little trace. A spoken language vanishes when its speakers are gone. A story told around a fire does not fossilize. A wooden tool decays. A woven basket turns to dust. Even dwellings made of earth and plant material disappear quickly once abandoned. What survives are the exceptions: stone tools, bone fragments, occasional art etched or painted onto surfaces protected by chance. These fragments are invaluable, but they are incomplete, and they shape our picture of the past in subtle ways. Stone tools, for example, dominate our understanding of prehistoric technology, largely because stone survives. Early humans almost certainly used wood, fibre, hide, and plant materials extensively. Spears tipped with sharpened wood, containers made of bark, clothing sewn from animal skins, shelters built from branches and grasses. None of this lasts long enough to greet an archaeologist tens of thousands of years later. As a result, prehistory can appear more technologically static than it truly was. When we look at the stone record alone, we see long periods where tools change slowly. Hand axes persist for hundreds of thousands of years with only minor variations. Scrapers, blades, and points evolve gradually. At first glance, this seems to suggest a lack of innovation, but this interpretation assumes that stone tools were the primary focus of technological creativity. It's far more likely that they were only one component of a much richer toolkit, much of which is now invisible to us. There is also a tendency to underestimate prehistoric minds because their societies did not produce what we recognize as civilization. This is a dangerous shortcut. Cognitive capacity does not depend on farming or architecture. The brains of early Homo sapiens were fully modern. They were capable of abstraction, planning, symbolic thought, and emotional complexity. Evidence for this appears in burials that include grave goods, suggesting beliefs about death and identity. It appears in art that depicts animals, handprints, and geometric patterns. It appears in the careful selection of materials transported over long distances, implying trade networks or at least repeated contact between groups. Consider the act of making a stone tool itself. Knapping stone requires foresight. The maker must visualize the final shape, understand how force travels through the material, and strike at precise angles. This is not random bashing. It is controlled, learned behavior passed down through teaching and practice. In many cases, the raw material was sourced from locations far from where the tools were found, indicating planning and movement across landscapes. Yet for all this intelligence and adaptability, prehistoric human societies remained relatively small and mobile. This was not because they were incapable of doing otherwise. Mobility offered advantages. It reduced pressure on local resources. It allowed groups to respond flexibly to climate changes. It avoided the build-up of waste and disease that comes with dense populations. In many environments, a mobile lifestyle was not a stepping stone to something better. It was the optimal solution. This is where the idea of a long silence can be misleading. It wasn't a silence of inactivity. It was a silence of accumulation. Knowledge existed, but it was carried in bodies and minds, rather than stored in external systems. Skills were passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice. If a group was lost, its knowledge could be lost with it. There was no archive to preserve it beyond living memory. This fragility of transmission is crucial to understanding the gap that follows. A society that does not write does not build long-term memory outside itself. It relies on continuity of people. When conditions change rapidly, through climate shifts, disease, or catastrophe, entire traditions can vanish almost overnight, leaving little behind to suggest they ever existed. The prehistoric world was also far from stable. Over the past few 100,000 years, Earth's climate oscillated dramatically. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by over 100 meters. Land bridges appeared and disappeared. Entire ecosystems shifted. Human groups were forced to move, adapt, or perish. These changes shaped behavior in ways that don't align neatly with linear progress. During colder periods, resources became scarce. Groups may have merged, competed, or fragmented. During warmer periods, populations expanded into new territories. Coastlines, which today host some of the densest human populations, were often drowned during sea level rise, taking with them evidence of early settlements that now lie underwater and largely unexplored. This alone may account for a significant portion of what appears missing. Another factor often overlooked is time depth itself. When we say a tool tradition lasted 50,000 years, that doesn't mean nothing changed during that time. It means that the changes were subtle enough, or the records sparse enough, that we group them together. Human lives during prehistory were not repetitive loops. They were filled with births, deaths, conflicts, innovations and social shifts that rarely register at the scale we're able to observe. There is also the question of specialization. Civilization, as we understand it, relies on people doing different things. Farmers grow food, builders construct shelters, priests manage rituals, administrators keep records. This division of labour requires surplus, coordination and stability. Prehistoric societies often lack the consistent surplus needed to support full-time specialists. That doesn't mean specialisation didn't exist. It likely did, but in more fluid forms. A skilled toolmaker might also hunt. A healer might also gather food. Roles could shift depending on season and circumstance. This flexibility was a strength, but it also limited the accumulation of highly specialised knowledge in fixed institutions. Without permanent workshops, schools or temples, knowledge remained personal and contextual. When conditions favoured it, that knowledge could deepen. When conditions turned harsh, survival took precedence. What makes the later emergence of civilization so striking is that it seems to compress multiple developments into a short period. Permanent settlements, agriculture, monument building, formalised religion, writing. Each of these could, in theory, have developed independently over long stretches of time. Instead, they appear clustered. To understand why, we have to appreciate how different the prehistoric baseline was. Prehistory was not a waiting room for civilization. It was a complete mode of existence, refined over immense spans of time. Humans were deeply attuned to their environments. They understood animal behaviour, seasonal cycles, plant properties, and landscape features with an intimacy that modern societies often lack. This knowledge was practical, embodied, and local. It did not scale easily beyond the group. When we call this period a silence, we are really naming our own difficulty in hearing it. We're used to histories that speak loudly through monuments and texts. Prehistoric humanity speaks softly, through patterns that must be inferred rather than read. And because of that, it's tempting to underestimate how much was happening beneath the surface. There is a growing recognition among researchers that the cognitive and cultural groundwork for civilization was laid long before cities appeared. Symbolic thought, long-distance exchange, ritual behaviour, and social complexity all existed in prehistoric contexts. What was missing was not intelligence or creativity, but a particular set of conditions that allowed those traits to crystallize into permanent cumulative systems. Those conditions were not guaranteed. They depended on climate stability, resource concentration, population density, and social structures that favoured long-term cooperation over mobility. When those factors aligned, change could accelerate rapidly. When they didn't, societies could remain stable for tens of thousands of years without transforming in the way we now label as progress. This helps explain why the transition to civilization feels abrupt. It's not that nothing happened before, but that much of what happened did not leave durable traces, and much of what did was shaped by priorities very different from our own. Prehistoric humanity was not racing towards cities. It was responding to the world as it was, moment by moment, generation by generation. When we look closely at the material traces left behind by prehistoric humans, stone tools tend to dominate the conversation, not because they were the most important objects in daily life, but because they are the ones that survived. Stone does not rot, rust, or dissolve easily. It waits. Because of that, it becomes the primary voice speaking to us across deep time, and when we actually listen to what that voice is telling us, the story it tells is quieter, but also more unsettling than the simple narrative of gradual improvement we're often taught. At first glance, stone tools can seem basic: a sharp edge, a pointed tip, a flake struck from a core. It's easy to imagine early humans experimenting clumsily, learning through trial and error, slowly refining their techniques over tens of thousands of years. But when archaeologists began to study these tools carefully, measuring angles, examining fracture patterns, and replicating the techniques experimentally, a different picture started to emerge. Many of the earlier stone tools we've found already show a level of control and consistency that suggests long-standing traditions rather than first attempts. Take Acheulean hand axes, for example. These tools appear around 1.7 million years ago and persist for well over 1 million years across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. They're often symmetrical, carefully shaped, and remarkably standardized. Some are so well balanced that modern researchers have struggled to replicate them without extensive training. The maker had to understand not just how to break stone, but how to anticipate how it would break, how force would travel through it, and how each strike would affect the final shape several steps ahead. What makes this particularly strange is not just their quality, but their timing. These tools appear very early in the archaeological record and remain relatively unchanged for immense spans of time. That stability is unusual. In many technologies, refinement leads to rapid diversification. Here, we see mastery without obvious progression, as though a high level of skill was reached and then deliberately maintained rather than constantly reinvented. This raises a quiet but persistent question. How long did it take to develop these techniques before they appear in the record? Stone tools do not preserve their learning curve. We see the result, not the process. The failed attempts, the broken pieces, the teaching moments, the incremental refinements may have happened long before the earliest examples we've found, or in places where preservation was poor. By the time stone becomes visible to us archaeologically, the skill may already be mature. There is also the issue of raw material selection. Prehistoric toolmakers did not simply pick up the nearest rock. They often chose specific types of stone, such as flint, obsidian, or chert, each with predictable fracture properties. In many cases, these materials were transported over long distances, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. This implies not only geological knowledge, but planning, route familiarity, and possibly social exchange networks that allowed materials to move between groups. Obsidian, in particular, is revealing. It produces extremely sharp edges, but is brittle and difficult to work. Successfully knapping obsidian requires precision and restraint. Too much force shatters it. Too little does nothing. Yet obsidian tools appear in prehistoric contexts with clean, controlled edges, indicating a deep familiarity with the material. In some regions, obsidian artifacts have been traced back to specific volcanic sources, showing that people repeatedly returned to the same locations or maintained long-distance connections to obtain it. The level of consistency across regions is also striking. Similar techniques appear in widely separated populations with no obvious direct contact. This doesn't necessarily mean global communication, but it does suggest that humans, once equipped with certain cognitive and motor abilities, converged on similar solutions. Still, the speed at which these solutions appear challenges the idea of a slow, hesitant technological awakening. Another layer of complexity emerges when we consider composite tools. A stone blade on its own is useful, but many prehistoric tools were part of larger assemblies. Stone points were hafted onto wooden shafts using bindings and adhesives made from plant resins, animal sinew, or bitumen. These materials rarely survive, but traces of adhesives have been found on stone tools dating back tens of thousands of years. Making a composite tool is a multi-step process. It requires gathering different materials, processing them correctly, understanding how they interact, and assembling them in the right sequence. Adhesives often had to be heated to specific temperatures to become workable, then cooled at the right time to set properly. This is not accidental behaviour. It reflects procedural knowledge passed down through generations. Some of the earliest evidence for these techniques pushes back much further than once believed. Hafted tools appear earlier than the emergence of agriculture, earlier than permanent settlements, earlier than what we typically associate with complex technology. In other words, sophisticated engineering was already present in societies that are often described as simple. Then there is the matter of precision itself. Experimental archaeologists have shown that producing certain blade types requires an understanding of angles and force that borders on mathematical intuition. The napper must strike at just the right point, with just the right amount of energy, often while holding the core at a specific orientation. Mistakes ruin the piece. Success suggests practice and muscle memory developed over many years. This kind of skill does not arise spontaneously. It implies apprenticeship, teaching, correction, and repetition. Someone had to show someone else how to do it, likely repeatedly, likely over long periods of time. That teaching did not leave behind written manuals. It lived in gestures, demonstrations, and shared experience. When we see a finely made tool, we're also seeing the invisible presence of teachers, learners, and a social structure capable of supporting that transfer of knowledge. What complicates the picture further is that some stone tools show evidence of aesthetic concern beyond pure function. Symmetry, balance, and finish appear even when they do not clearly improve performance. Some hand axes, for instance, are so finely made that they appear almost ceremonial. Their edges are sharp, but they show little evidence of use. This has led some researchers to suggest that they may have served social or symbolic purposes, perhaps signalling skill, status, or identity. If that is the case, then stone tools were not just practical objects. They were also part of social communication. Making a beautiful or impressive tool may have conveyed information about the maker's competence, reliability, or standing within a group. This introduces an entirely different dimension to prehistoric technology, one where craftsmanship is tied to social meaning rather than mere survival. There are also instances where tools appear to be over-engineered for their task. Some hunting points are far more delicate than necessary to kill an animal. Their thinness and regularity suggest a desire for efficiency or precision that goes beyond brute force. In some cases, the tools are so finely made that they would have been fragile in use, implying that their role may not have been purely utilitarian. This pattern challenges the assumption that prehistoric humans always optimized for simplicity. Instead, it suggests that they sometimes pursued refinement, consistency, and perhaps even beauty, long before those qualities were formally recognized or recorded. Another point worth considering is the sheer timescale involved. When a particular tool tradition persists for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, it indicates stability. That stability could reflect satisfaction with a solution that works well, but it could also reflect cultural conservatism, where deviation from established methods is discouraged. In either case, it implies a shared understanding of how things should be done. That understanding had to be maintained across generations without written instructions. It relied on memory, imitation, and social reinforcement. This kind of continuity is difficult to sustain, especially in mobile societies facing environmental pressures, and yet it happened. All of this makes the later acceleration of technological change even more curious. If humans were capable of such precision and control so early, why did many other forms of complexity appear so much later? Why do we not see a gradual build-up of increasingly complex tools, leading smoothly into agriculture, architecture, and writing? Instead, we see long periods of apparent stasis followed by rapid diversification. One possibility is that the limitations were not cognitive or technical, but contextual. Stone tools could be mastered within small groups. Agriculture requires land stability. Writing requires administrative needs. Monument building requires coordinated labour and surplus resources. These conditions may simply not have aligned until much later. Still, the skills themselves were already there. The hands that shaped stone with precision were the same hands that would later shape bricks and carve inscriptions. The minds that anticipated fracture lines were capable of anticipating seasonal cycles, structural stresses, and symbolic systems. Nothing fundamental had to change inside the human brain. This leads us back to the unsettling feeling that something is missing from the story. Not necessarily a lost civilization, but a lost continuity. A sense that the deep expertise evident in early tools belongs to a longer, richer tradition than the fragments we've recovered can fully reveal. When we hold a prehistoric stone tool, we are holding the endpoint of a process we cannot fully see. Behind it lies practice, teaching, experimentation, and cultural norms that left little durable trace. The tool itself is like a sentence torn from a book whose pages have mostly disintegrated. We can read the sentence, admire its structure, and recognize its competence, but we cannot easily reconstruct the chapters that led up to it. For a very long time, human history appears to move at a measured, almost unhurried pace. Generations follow one another, tools change slowly, ways of living adapt carefully to landscapes and seasons. Then, within a relatively short span of time, something changes so dramatically that it reshapes how we describe everything that came before and everything that follows. Villages turn into towns, towns grow into cities, fields replace wild landscapes, storage replaces immediacy, writing appears, hierarchies solidify, time itself begins to be counted, recorded, divided, and managed. This moment is often called the dawn of civilization, but what makes it unsettling is not that it happened, it's how quickly it seems to happen, and how little preparation we can clearly see leading up to it. From a distance, it can look like a natural progression. Humans learn to farm, farming leads to surplus, surplus supports specialists, specialists create complexity, neat, logical, reassuring. Yet when archaeologists and historians look closely at the evidence, that smooth progression starts to fracture. In many places, civilization does not arrive gently or gradually. It appears abruptly, already complex, already organized, already dependent on systems that seem to require a long period of testing and refinement that we struggle to document. This is the sudden spark. The moment when human societies cross a threshold so quickly that it feels less like a slow sunrise and more like a light switching on in a dark room. One of the most striking aspects of this transition is its timing. For tens of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans live without cities, without writing, without large-scale agriculture. Then, roughly within the last 12,000 years, multiple regions of the world independently develop complex societies. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, northern China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Different environments, different cultures, different plants and animals. Yet the structural outcomes look surprisingly similar. Permanent settlements, monumental architecture, social stratification, formal religion, administrative systems. The speed of this transformation is difficult to ignore. In some regions, the time between small villages and fully developed urban centres spans only a few thousand years. In the context of human evolutionary history, that is barely a moment. It raises an uncomfortable question. If the conditions for civilization existed for so long, why did it take so long to appear? And once it did, why did it move so fast? Part of the answer lies in stability. For much of prehistory, Earth's climate was volatile. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably. Coastlines rose and fell. In such conditions, investing in permanent infrastructure was risky. Mobility was a safer strategy. But around the end of the last ice age, the climate entered a relatively stable period known as the Holocene. Seasons became more predictable, temperature fluctuations softened, In many regions, plants and animals responded by expanding their ranges and becoming more reliable resources. This stability created opportunity, but opportunity alone does not explain the suddenness. Stability does not automatically produce cities. It merely allows them to survive once they appear. The deeper mystery is how human societies reorganized themselves so rapidly once the door opened. Agriculture is often presented as the catalyst, but agriculture itself is part of the puzzle. Farming requires planning across seasons, delayed returns on labour and coordinated effort. It also brings new problems: soil exhaustion, crop failure, disease, inequality. Early farmers often had worse health than hunter-gatherers. Their lives were harder in many measurable ways. This makes it difficult to argue that agriculture was an obvious improvement eagerly adopted by everyone. In some regions, people seem to have resisted farming for long periods, even when they were aware of it. In others, farming appears to spread rapidly once established, displacing or absorbing existing lifeways. This suggests that agriculture was not simply a technological upgrade, but part of a broader social shift, one that restructured how humans related to land, time, and each other. Once people settled permanently, everything else accelerated. Storage required containers and accounting. Property required boundaries and enforcement. Larger populations required organization, conflict resolution, and shared belief systems. Religion became formalized, not necessarily because people suddenly became spiritual, but because shared rituals helped to bind growing communities together and legitimize emerging power structures. Writing emerges in this context not as literature but as administration. The earliest writing systems are lists, tallies, records of grain, labour and ownership. They appear fully functional, capable of representing complex information almost immediately. There is little evidence of long experimental phases where writing is clumsy or incomplete. When it arrives, it works. The same pattern appears in architecture. Early monumental structures are not crude. They require planning, geometry, and coordination of large workforces. Stone blocks are quarried, transported, and fitted with precision. Alignments with celestial events suggest careful observation over long periods. These are not improvisations. They're expressions of knowledge that seems to have matured quickly. What's especially striking is that many of these developments appear almost simultaneously within individual regions. It's not as though writing emerges thousands of years after cities, or cities thousands of years after farming. The elements cluster. Once the threshold is crossed, multiple systems lock into place rapidly, reinforcing one another. This clustering effect gives civilization its explosive quality. Each new development creates conditions that support others. Surplus supports specialists. Specialists create new tools and institutions. Institutions stabilize surplus. The system feeds itself. Once underway, it's hard to stop. But this still leaves the question of the warm-up. Where are the half-formed versions of these systems? Where are the early awkward attempts at urban planning, at record-keeping, at large-scale cooperation? They exist, but they are fewer and less clear than we might expect given the complexity of what follows. One possibility is that much of this preparation occurred in ways that do not preserve well archaeologically. Social structures, leadership roles, oral traditions, ritual calendars, and shared myths could all evolve extensively without leaving durable material traces. By the time physical evidence becomes visible, the underlying social software may already be well developed. Another possibility is that population density plays a critical role. Once human populations reach a certain threshold, ideas spread faster, innovations accumulate more quickly, and feedback loops intensify. What appears sudden may simply be the visible tipping point of a long, slow build-up that crossed a critical mass. Yet even this explanation struggles to account for the sophistication of early civilizations. Population density alone does not explain advanced astronomy, standardized measurement systems, or complex symbolic frameworks. These require continuity, memory, and sustained observation across generations. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that our timelines are incomplete. Rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age submerged vast coastal areas where early human settlements were likely concentrated. Shorelines are attractive places to live. They provide food, transportation, and stable climates. If significant developments occurred in these now submerged regions, much of the evidence may simply be inaccessible or destroyed. This loss would create the illusion of sudden appearance inland, when in reality, the story began earlier along coasts we no longer see. Underwater archaeology has already revealed submerged structures, tools, and landscapes that hint at more complex coastal lifeways than previously assumed. It is not unreasonable to think that important steps toward a civilization happened there, out of sight. There is also the issue of collapse. Human societies do not always move forward in straight lines. They rise, fragment, reorganize, and sometimes disappear. Knowledge can be lost as easily as it is gained, especially when it is not externally recorded. It is possible that early experiments in settlement, agriculture, or social organization occurred, failed, and left little trace beyond scattered debris that we have not yet recognized as significant. If that is the case, then civilization's sudden appearance may actually be a reappearance, built on lessons learned and forgotten multiple times. Not a single lost age, but a pattern of emergence and erasure that compresses our visible record. This idea doesn't require advanced ancient empires hidden beneath the sands. It only requires acknowledging that human societies are fragile, and that deep time is very good at erasing complexity, unless it is repeatedly reinforced. What makes the sudden spark so compelling is not that it suggests mystery for mystery's sake, but that it exposes the limits of our confidence. We like histories that move smoothly, that reward patience with clarity. The emergence of civilization resists that preference. It feels rushed, crowded, almost impatient, as though multiple strands of development converged at once after waiting a very long time to do so. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. For thousands of generations, humans refined skills, relationships, and ways of thinking suited to mobility and flexibility. When the environment stabilized and populations grew, those latent capacities found new outlets. The shift was not from ignorance to knowledge, but from one mode of organization to another. Still, the speed remained striking. Even allowing for missing evidence and submerged landscapes, the fact remains that once civilization takes hold, it does not creep, it surges. Cities grow rapidly, trade networks expand, written traditions multiply. Time itself becomes segmented into calendars, reigns, and recorded events. From this point on, history becomes loud. Texts speak. Monuments insist on being remembered. Names endure. The long prehistoric quiet gives way to a chorus of voices, each claiming permanence. Yet that quiet never fully disappears. It lingers beneath the noise, reminding us that the foundations of civilization were laid in a world that did not record itself, a world whose achievements were real but fleeting, whose knowledge was embodied rather than archived. For a long time, the story of early civilization rested on a comfortable sequence of assumptions. Humans learned to farm. Farming led to permanent settlements. Settlements allowed populations to grow. Larger populations created the need for organization, leadership, religion, and monumental building. It was a tidy chain, easy to remember, and it placed large construction projects firmly at the end of the process. You build temples and monuments only after you have villages, surplus food, and a workforce that can be fed while not producing food themselves. Then Gobekli Tepe quietly disrupted that order. Located in what is now southeastern Turkey, Gobekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge overlooking a landscape that 12,000 years ago was rich in wild grasses and game. When it was first identified in the 1990s, it did not immediately announce itself as revolutionary. Stone tools littered the surface, as they do at many prehistoric sites. But as excavations began, something unexpected emerged from beneath the soil. Massive stone pillars, carved and arranged in deliberate circular patterns, far older than Stonehenge, far older than the pyramids, and predating agriculture as we usually understand it. The dates alone were enough to force a pause. Gobekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, give or take a few centuries. That places it at the very beginning of the Holocene, just after the last ice age, and thousands of years before the first known cities. According to the conventional model, the people of this time should have been small groups of hunter-gatherers, mobile, egalitarian, and lacking the organisational capacity for large-scale construction. Yet here was a site that required planning, coordination, skilled labour, and sustained effort over long periods. The stone pillars themselves are impossible to ignore. Some stand over 5 metres tall and weigh up to 16 tonnes. They are T-shaped, carefully carved from local limestone and decorated with reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, birds, boars, insects, and abstract symbols. The carvings are not crude. They show confidence, consistency, and a shared visual language. These were not random scratches. They were deliberate expressions of meaning. Arranged in circular enclosures, the pillars appear to face inward, often with 2 larger central pillars dominating each space. The geometry is intentional. The circles are not perfect, but they are clearly planned. Building them would have required quarrying stone, shaping it with stone tools, transporting massive blocks across uneven terrain, erecting them upright, and stabilising them in prepared sockets. This is not something that happens accidentally or casually. What makes Gobekli Tepe particularly challenging is not just its scale or artistry, but its context. There is no clear evidence of permanent domestic structures nearby from the same period. No houses, no storage facilities, no signs of everyday village life that we would normally associate with a labour force capable of such work. The people who built Gobekli Tepe appear to have gathered there for a specific purpose, then left. This immediately creates a problem for the traditional sequence. If people were not settled farmers, how did they organise the labour needed to build this place? How did they feed the workers? How did they transmit the knowledge required to design and construct such structures? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did they do it? One proposed answer is that Gobekli Tepe was a ritual centre, a place of gathering for dispersed groups. People may have come seasonally, drawn by shared beliefs, ceremonies, or social obligations. In this view, religion or ritual did not emerge after agriculture. It may have helped drive people toward it. Coordinating large gatherings would require reliable food sources. Managing those gatherings could encourage experimentation with cultivation. If this is correct, then belief came before bread. This flips the old model on its head. Instead of farming enabling monuments, monuments may have helped motivate farming. The need to support ritual gatherings could have pushed people toward managing wild resources more intensively, eventually leading to domestication. But even this explanation leaves gaps. Seasonal gatherings still require leadership, planning, and continuity. Someone had to decide where to quarry stone, how to design the enclosures, which symbols to carve, and how to coordinate repeated construction efforts over centuries. Gobekli Tepe was not built all at once. It was used, modified, and expanded over many generations. That implies a shared cultural framework strong enough to persist over time, even as groups remained largely mobile. Oral traditions would have had to preserve not just stories, but architectural knowledge, symbolic systems, and social roles. The builders were not improvising. They were following a plan that made sense to them and to those who came after. The carvings themselves deepen the mystery. The animals depicted are not random. They appear repeatedly across different enclosures. Some scholars suggest they may represent clans, myths, constellations, or symbolic forces. There are no clear depictions of agriculture or domestic animals. The world portrayed is still a hunter-gatherer world, filled with wild creatures and powerful forces. The T-shaped pillars are particularly intriguing. Some researchers interpret them as stylized human figures. They have arms carved along their sides and hands resting near the front. If this interpretation is correct, then the enclosures may represent gatherings of beings, not just stones. Whether these beings were ancestors, spirits, deities, or symbolic representations of social groups is still debated. What is difficult to dispute is that Gobekli Tepe represents a level of symbolic abstraction that we were not expecting at this point in time. This is not simple decoration. It is a coherent visual system, repeated and refined across multiple structures. Then there is the deliberate burial of the site. At some point, after centuries of use, the enclosures were intentionally filled in with earth, stone fragments, and debris. This was not abandonment due to collapse or disaster. It appears to have been a purposeful act. The builders buried their own monument, sealing it beneath the hill. Why would a society invest so much effort into creating a place, only to deliberately cover it up? There are many possibilities: ritual closure, cultural transition, changing beliefs, environmental pressures. None are fully satisfying on their own. What matters is that this act too implies organisation and shared intent. Burial on this scale is not something done haphazardly. Gobekli Tepe also forces us to reconsider assumptions about social hierarchy. Large construction projects are often associated with centralised authority, coercion, or rigid class systems. Yet hunter-gatherer societies are typically described as egalitarian. How do we reconcile that with the labour demands of Gobekli Tepe? One possibility is that leadership existed, but in forms that did not resemble later kings or priests. Authority may have been situational, earned through skill, knowledge, or ritual expertise rather than enforced through permanent power structures. Cooperation may have been motivated by shared belief rather than obligation. Another possibility is that we are underestimating the complexity of late prehistoric societies. Mobility does not preclude organisation. Oral cultures can be extraordinarily effective at preserving detailed knowledge. Social bonds formed through kinship, ritual, and shared identity can motivate collective action without formal institutions. Gobekli Tepe sits at the intersection of these possibilities. It does not fit neatly into any single category. It is too early to be agricultural civilization, too complex to be dismissed as simple hunter-gatherer behaviour. This makes it a focal point for the broader question of the unexplained gap. If something like Gobekli Tepe could exist before farming, before cities, before writing, then our understanding of what prehistoric societies were capable of needs adjustment. It suggests that the capacity for large-scale organisation, symbolic thought, and long-term planning existed well before the material conditions we usually associate with them. It also suggests that much of what we think of as the foundation of civilization may have been cultural rather than technological. Shared meaning may have come first, infrastructure followed. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that Gobekli Tepe is not unique, only uniquely preserved. Similar sites may have existed elsewhere, built from materials that did not survive, or located in areas now submerged or destroyed. If so, then what we see as an anomaly may actually be a rare window into a much broader pattern. The site's discovery has already prompted archaeologists to re-examine other locations that were previously dismissed as insignificant. It has encouraged more attention to ritual behaviour, symbolic landscapes, and the role of belief in shaping early human societies. It has also exposed how much our interpretations depend on what we expect to find. Gobekli Tepe does not tell us exactly who the first builders were or what they believed. It does not provide written explanations or clear answers. What it does provide is a challenge to linear timelines, a challenge to tidy models, a challenge to the idea that complexity must always follow a specific order. It reminds us that humans did not wait passively for the right conditions to become imaginative, organised, or ambitious. Those qualities were already present, waiting for opportunities to express themselves in new ways. Gobekli Tepe stands not as a lone exception, but as a signpost. It marks a point where the silence of prehistory grows just loud enough to disrupt our confidence, inviting us to look more carefully at what might still be hidden in the long stretch between the first stone tools and the first cities, where human societies were already experimenting with meaning, structure, and permanence in ways that history is only beginning to recognize. When agriculture enters the human story, it does not arrive timidly. It does not creep in through a long, clearly documented series of tentative experiments that gradually improve over thousands upon thousands of years. Instead, it appears in multiple regions as a functioning system, already capable of sustaining large populations, already reshaping landscapes, already reorganizing human life at every level. This is what makes its arrival so unsettling when viewed alongside the long prehistoric backdrop that came before it. After tens of thousands of years spent hunting, gathering, and moving with the seasons, humans suddenly begin planting, harvesting, storing, and staying put, and they do so with a competence that suggests far more preparation than the evidence comfortably supports. For a long time, agriculture was framed as an obvious breakthrough, a clear upgrade from an uncertain life of foraging to a more reliable existence built around controlled food production. The story was simple. People discovered that seeds grow into plants. They began tending them. Over time, this practice improved. Eventually, farming replaced hunting and gathering. Civilization followed naturally. Yet when archaeologists began to examine the earliest agricultural sites in detail, that simplicity began to dissolve. Early farming was not easier. It was harder in many measurable ways. Skeletal remains from early agricultural populations often show signs of malnutrition, increased disease, dental problems, and physical strain. Diets became less varied. Workloads increased. Dependence on a narrow range of crops made communities vulnerable to drought, pests, and failure. From a purely survival-based perspective, the shift to agriculture makes surprisingly little sense as an immediate improvement. This raises an important question. If farming made life harder in the short term, why was it adopted at all, and why did it spread so rapidly once it appeared? Part of the answer lies in scale. Agriculture does not need to benefit individuals to transform societies. It benefits systems. Farming allows more people to live in the same area. It produces surplus that can be stored, taxed, redistributed, and controlled. It supports specialization, hierarchy, and long-term planning. These features are essential for large, complex societies, but they do not necessarily improve daily life for everyone involved. What complicates matters further is the way agriculture appears in the archaeological record. In multiple regions, domesticated plants emerge abruptly, already exhibiting traits that distinguish them clearly from their wild ancestors. Larger seeds, thinner husks, reduced seed dispersal mechanisms. These are not trivial changes. They are the result of sustained selective pressure over many generations. Yet in many cases, the intermediate stages are sparse or difficult to trace. The wild ancestors are known. The domesticated forms are known. The long sequence of gradual change between them often appears compressed or missing. This gives the impression that agriculture arrived with no clear practice run, already functional enough to reshape entire ecosystems. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent are a classic example. The earliest domesticated varieties show multiple genetic changes that would have required consistent selection. This implies not just casual gathering of wild grains, but intentional harvesting, replanting, and management over extended periods. However, the archaeological footprint of this long experimentation phase is faint. We see the outcome more clearly than the process. The same pattern appears elsewhere: rice in East Asia, maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes. Each of these crops required sophisticated understanding of local environments, seasonal cycles, and plant behavior. Maize, in particular, is striking. Its wild ancestor, teosinte, looks nothing like modern corn. The transformation between the two is so dramatic that early researchers struggle to believe they were related at all. And yet, by the time maize appears as a staple crop, it is already deeply integrated into human societies. This suggests that the knowledge required to manage these plants existed well before agriculture became dominant. People were not ignorant of plant life. Hunter-gatherers had intimate botanical knowledge. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were toxic, and when each was available. In many environments, they actively managed landscapes through practices like controlled burning, selective harvesting, and encouraging the growth of useful species. In other words, humans were already shaping ecosystems long before formal agriculture. The shift was not from ignorance to knowledge, but from flexible management to fixed investment. Still, the speed of the transition remains striking. In some regions, the move from foraging to farming occurs within a few centuries. Entire ways of life change rapidly. Settlements grow, tools shift, social structures reorganize. Once agriculture takes hold, it spreads aggressively, often displacing or absorbing other lifeways. One reason for this may be demographic pressure. Farming supports higher population densities. Even if early farmers lived harder lives, their societies could grow faster. Over time, sheer numbers would allow agricultural communities to expand into territories occupied by foragers, not necessarily through violence, but through gradual encroachment and competition for resources. Another factor is social inertia. Once a community invests in fields, irrigation, storage facilities, and seasonal cycles tied to planting and harvest, turning back becomes difficult. Agriculture locks people into place. It creates obligations that stretch across years rather than days. It binds communities to land and to each other in new ways. What is less clear is how the organisational knowledge required to manage all of this develops so quickly. Farming is not just planting seeds. It requires calendars. It requires coordinated labour. It requires storage systems and rules for distribution. It requires conflict resolution when resources are scarce. It requires mechanisms for passing knowledge reliably across generations. These systems appear alongside agriculture almost immediately. We do not see long periods where people farm inefficiently without storage or plant without understanding seasonal timing. Early agricultural societies seem to grasp the full package quickly, as though the conceptual framework was already in place. This is where the idea of a missing preparatory phase becomes difficult to ignore. It is possible that much of the groundwork for agriculture occurred in contexts that left little archaeological trace. Seasonal camps, temporary processing sites, landscapes modified gradually through repeated use, knowledge transmitted orally and embodied in practice rather than recorded in durable form. It is also possible that climate instability before the Holocene discouraged permanent commitment to farming, even if the knowledge existed. Experimentation may have occurred repeatedly, only to be abandoned when conditions shifted. Each attempt would leave faint traces, easily erased by time until stability allowed one version to persist and expand. Another possibility is that early ritual and social structures played a role. Large gatherings, feasts and ceremonies require predictable food supplies. The pressure to provide for these events could encourage more intensive management of plants and animals. Over time, what began as supplemental cultivation could become central. This aligns with sites like Gobekli Tepe, where monumental construction appears before clear evidence of agriculture. If people were already gathering in large numbers for symbolic reasons, the incentive to control food production would increase dramatically. In this view, farming emerges not as a purely economic innovation, but as a social one. Animal domestication follows a similarly puzzling pattern. Dogs appear early, likely integrated into human societies long before agriculture. Other animals, such as sheep, goats and cattle, appear later, but again with surprising speed. Domestication requires selective breeding, controlled mating, and long-term management. These practices demand patience, planning, and an understanding of animal behaviour that goes beyond opportunistic hunting. Yet early domesticated animals appear alongside early farming communities, already serving specific roles: meat, milk, labour, transport. Their integration suggests that humans were not simply stumbling into domestication, but applying knowledge deliberately. What all of this points to is a deeper continuity between prehistory and civilization than our timelines often acknowledge. Agriculture does not represent a sudden intellectual leap. It represents a reorganization of existing knowledge under new conditions. The lack of a clear practice run may not mean there was none. It may mean that the practice run was scattered, interrupted, and largely invisible to us. It may also mean that our expectations for what early experimentation should look like are shaped by modern assumptions about progress. We expect innovation to be linear, cumulative, and visible. But human societies do not always work that way. Knowledge can plateau. It can be conserved rather than expanded. It can be abandoned and rediscovered. It can exist without scaling until the right pressures appear. Agriculture may have been one such case, a set of practices understood but not universally adopted until circumstances aligned. When they did, the transition was rapid because the conceptual groundwork was already laid. This perspective does not diminish the significance of agriculture. If anything, it deepens it. It reframes farming not as a simple technological breakthrough, but as a tipping point where multiple strands of human experience converged. Environmental stability, population pressure, social organization, ritual life, ecological knowledge, all locking together. Once that lock engaged, the consequences were enormous. Landscapes were transformed. Human relationships with nature shifted permanently. Time became seasonal and scheduled rather than opportunistic. Property emerged. Inequality grew. History accelerated. And yet, beneath this acceleration lies the quiet continuity of prehistoric knowledge, carried forward into a new mode of existence. The hands that planted the first fields were not naive. They belonged to people who'd spent generations reading the land, tracking cycles, and managing resources in ways that did not always leave marks we can easily see. What we know about the distant human past is shaped less by what people once knew, and more by what managed to survive. Bone, stone, and earth act like a narrow filter, allowing certain kinds of information through while quietly erasing others. This is not because prehistoric humans failed to create knowledge, but because most forms of knowledge are fragile. They live in movement, in speech, in repetition, in practice. When those carriers disappear, the knowledge goes with them, leaving behind only faint impressions that are easy to misread. When archaeologists reconstruct prehistoric life, they work from what remains physically present: a stone blade, a fragment of bone, a pattern of post holes in compacted soil. These remnants are treated as data points, but they are incomplete translations of much richer systems. A stone tool tells us something about technique, but very little about teaching. A bone with cut marks reveals butchery, but not the rules governing food distribution. A hearth shows fire use, but not the stories told around it or the social bonds reinforced there. This imbalance creates an illusion. It can make the past appear simpler than it was, not because it truly was simpler, but because complexity tends to vanish unless it is deliberately externalized in durable form. Writing survives. Stone survives. Everything else fades. Consider bone first. Bone tools appear very early in the archaeological record, sometimes tens of thousands of years before agriculture. They include awls, needles, points, and ornaments. These objects imply activities that stone alone cannot explain: sewing tailored clothing, weaving or binding materials, fishing with nets or lines, adornment that communicates identity, status, or group belonging. Each of these activities requires procedural knowledge. Making a bone needle is not useful unless you know how to thread it, how to pierce hides without tearing them, how to shape garments that fit bodies in motion. None of that survives in the object itself. The needle is only the final expression of a long chain of skills, most of which leave no trace. Bone tools also suggest planning beyond the immediate moment. Bones must be cleaned, shaped, sometimes polished. They are not always abundant in the right form. Their use implies anticipation, patience, and a sequence of actions carried out correctly. This kind of thinking is not accidental. It reflects mental models of process and outcome that exist independently of any single artifact. Stone tells a similar story but on a larger scale. As discussed earlier, stone tools show precision and consistency that imply teaching and tradition. What they do not show is how that teaching occurred. There are no classrooms, no diagrams, no manuals. Knowledge was transmitted through observation, imitation, correction, and repetition. These processes are social. They depend on trust, authority, and shared understanding. If a group lost its skilled members, that knowledge could vanish quickly. If conditions forced rapid migration or fragmentation, traditions could break. Over long spans of time, entire technological lineages could rise and fall without leaving a continuous record. Earth, too, holds traces of lost knowledge, but only indirectly. Soil layers preserve evidence of repeated activity. Compacted ground where people walked regularly. Chemical signatures from hearths and waste. Pollen records showing which plants dominated a landscape and when. From these clues, researchers infer land management practices that were invisible until recently. In many regions, hunter-gatherers actively shaped their environments. They burned undergrowth to encourage certain plants and attract game. They harvested selectively to promote regrowth. They transported useful species beyond their natural ranges. These practices blur the line between foraging and farming, suggesting a spectrum of ecological knowledge rather than a sudden leap. What is striking is how effective these methods were. Landscapes managed by indigenous groups often supported high biodiversity and long-term sustainability. This required intimate understanding of local ecosystems, seasonal rhythms, and cause and effect relationships that unfolded over years or decades. Again, almost none of this knowledge survives directly. We see the outcome, not the reasoning. This brings us to the idea of lost knowledge, not as a single vanished archive, but as countless small systems of understanding that never became fixed in material form. Navigation without maps, medicine without written recipes, astronomy without instruments, social governance without laws etched in stone. Take navigation as an example. Humans crossed vast distances long before compasses or charts. They moved across deserts, forests, ice sheets, and open water. This required mental maps built from landmarks, stars, winds, currents, animal behaviour and memory. Such maps existed entirely in the mind and in shared oral tradition. When those traditions broke, the maps disappeared completely. The same applies to medicine. Many prehistoric and indigenous societies possessed extensive pharmacological knowledge derived from plants, minerals, and animal products. Trial and error over generations identified effective treatments. Some of this knowledge survives where traditions remain unbroken. Much of it vanished when populations were displaced, reduced, or assimilated. Bone and stone do not tell us which leaves eased pain or which roots saved lives. Astronomy offers another revealing case. Alignments in stone structures, careful placement of burials, and repeated patterns in art suggest long-term observation of the sky. Tracking solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles, and stellar movements requires sustained attention over generations. This knowledge does not require writing, but it does require continuity. When we see precise alignments appear suddenly in early monumental sites, it can feel as though astronomical knowledge emerged out of nowhere. More likely it existed for a very long time in oral and ritual form, only becoming archaeologically visible when societies began to build in stone. Social knowledge is perhaps the most invisible of all. How decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, how leadership was recognized or challenged, how children were taught, how outsiders were treated. These systems govern daily life, yet they leave almost no physical trace. When they work well, they produce stability without monuments. When they fail, they can collapse societies quickly. In prehistoric contexts, social systems had to be flexible. Mobility required cooperation without rigid hierarchy. Leadership may have been situational, shifting with expertise rather than fixed roles. These forms of organisation do not fossilize. They disappear the moment the group does. This creates a skewed historical lens. Societies that built durable structures appear more complex because their complexity survives. Societies that invested in knowledge rather than monuments appear simpler because their knowledge does not. The gap between prehistory and civilization may therefore be exaggerated by preservation bias rather than actual difference. Lost knowledge also accumulates through catastrophe, climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, floods, disease. Rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age submerged vast coastal regions where humans had lived for millennia. These areas likely hosted dense populations with sophisticated ecological knowledge. When the seas rose, settlements vanished. Any accumulated expertise tied to those places vanished with them. What remained inland may have been fragments, people carrying memories, practices, and partial systems into new environments. In such situations, knowledge adapts, simplifies, or is abandoned depending on circumstances. Some traditions survive in altered form, others fade quietly. This fragmentation can make later developments appear novel when they are actually reconfigurations. Agriculture, architecture, and ritual systems may draw on older bodies of knowledge reshaped under new constraints. Without seeing the continuity, we interpret the outcome as invention rather than inheritance. There is also the role of taboo and secrecy. Not all knowledge is meant to be shared openly. Many societies restrict certain information to specific roles, ages, or initiatory stages. If those social structures collapse, restricted knowledge can disappear entirely, leaving no trace even among survivors. This may help explain why some skills appear suddenly, fully formed, with no visible apprenticeship phase. The apprenticeship existed, but within closed systems that did not externalize their processes. The Earth itself sometimes hides evidence deliberately. Later societies build over earlier ones, fields erase camps, cities bury villages, ritual sites are intentionally covered, as at Gobekli Tepe. In such cases, knowledge is not just lost by decay, but by choice. Cultural transitions can involve active forgetting. When a society changes its worldview, older practices may be abandoned, suppressed, or symbolically buried. This creates discontinuities that look like gaps from the outside, even though people experience them as deliberate breaks. All of this complicates the question of the unexplained gap. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of selectivity. Bone, stone, and earth preserve outcomes, not processes. They show us what was done, not how it was learned, taught, debated, or remembered. This means that when we encounter early civilizations that seem to arrive without preparation, we are likely seeing the first moment when accumulated knowledge finally becomes visible in durable form. Writing externalizes memory. Architecture externalizes planning. Agriculture externalizes ecological management. Before that point, the same capacities may have existed internally, socially, and orally. Lost knowledge is therefore not a single missing chapter, but a condition of deep history. It is the default state of human experience before external memory systems take hold. What survives is what resists time. What vanishes is often what mattered most in daily life. Long before written language fixed dates in place, and long before calendars divided the year into tidy segments, humans were already building things meant to last. Not shelters that could be abandoned when seasons changed, not camps meant to be dismantled and moved on from, but structures that demanded effort far beyond immediate survival. These monuments were not accidents of convenience, they were choices. And what makes them so unsettling is not only their age, but the confidence they display, as if the builders already understood permanence in a world that otherwise left little behind. When we think of monuments, the mind often jumps to familiar icons: Stonehenge, the pyramids, massive temples rising above cities. These feel ancient to us, but they sit comfortably within recorded history or just beyond it. What complicates the story is that once archaeologists began looking deeper, monuments started appearing in places and periods where, according to traditional models, they should not exist at all. Gobekli Tepe was only the beginning. Across the globe, structures emerged that predate agriculture, writing, and urban life, yet required planning, coordination, and symbolic intent. They are older than memory should allow, not because they are beyond time, but because they belong to cultures that left no written explanation for what they were doing or why. Consider megalithic structures more broadly. Large stones moved, shaped, and arranged with care. Dolmens, cairns, stone circles, alignments, and platforms appear across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Many date back to periods when populations were sparse and largely mobile. Moving a single multi-ton stone requires coordination, shared effort, and motivation strong enough to overcome immense physical cost. Doing this repeatedly implies organisation that challenges the image of loosely connected foraging bands. What is especially striking is the precision involved. Stones are often placed deliberately, aligned with landscape features, celestial events, or cardinal directions. This precision is not always obvious at first glance, but it becomes clear through measurement and repeated study. Alignments with solstices and equinoxes appear again and again. In some cases, lunar cycles are encoded in stone arrangements that would require long-term observation to identify accurately. These are not casual constructions. They suggest sustained attention to time, space, and pattern. They also suggest continuity. Observing a solstice once tells you nothing. Observing it year after year, generation after generation, allows patterns to be recognized, anticipated, and eventually marked. Monuments serve as memory devices, externalizing knowledge that would otherwise have to live entirely in the mind. This raises an immediate question. Who maintained that knowledge before the monuments existed? Tracking celestial cycles requires patience and record keeping, even if that record keeping is oral or symbolic rather than written. It requires social structures that value accuracy and continuity. It requires teaching, correction, and preservation of tradition. All of this must exist before the first stone is placed. The monument is not the beginning of the knowledge, it is the crystallization of it. In many cases, monuments appear in landscapes with no clear evidence of permanent settlement nearby. This suggests they were gathering places rather than residential centres. People may have travelled long distances to participate in rituals, ceremonies, or communal labour. Such gatherings require coordination across groups that may not live together year-round. They also require shared beliefs strong enough to motivate participation. Belief is often treated as an afterthought in discussions of early human societies, but monuments suggest it played a central role. Building something that does not directly feed or shelter you implies faith in meaning beyond immediate survival. Whether that meaning was spiritual, ancestral, cosmological, or social, it was powerful enough to justify immense effort. The materials chosen for monuments also matter. Stone is not the easiest material to work with, especially without metal tools. Wood is easier to shape and move, yet stone is chosen again and again for structures meant to endure. This choice reflects an understanding of time. Stone lasts, stone remembers. Stone speaks long after voices fall silent, yet stone also hides as much as it reveals. When we see a finished monument, we see the end point, not the process. We do not see the debates over placement, the failed attempts, the disagreements resolved, the rituals performed during construction. All of that is gone, leaving us with a mute structure that invites interpretation but resists certainty. Some monuments complicate matters further by being deliberately buried or dismantled. Gobekli Tepe is the most famous example, but it is not unique. In multiple cultures, monuments are intentionally covered, sealed, or taken apart. This suggests that monuments were not simply static symbols, but part of living traditions that could change, conclude, or be transformed. This intentional burial introduces a paradox. Why build something monumental if you plan to hide it? One possibility is ritual closure. Another is cultural transition. A society may decide that an old structure no longer serves its purpose or aligns with new beliefs. Burying it may be an act of respect rather than destruction. Whatever the reason, it reinforces the idea that these monuments were embedded in complex symbolic systems, not just feats of engineering. The age of some monuments also challenges assumptions about technological prerequisites. Stone construction does not require agriculture, but it does require time and energy. That energy must come from somewhere. Hunter-gatherer societies are often portrayed as living on the edge of subsistence, but evidence suggests that many were highly efficient at resource acquisition, leaving them with periods of relative abundance. Seasonal abundance could free up time for communal projects. Large gatherings during peak resource availability could concentrate labour temporarily, without permanent settlement. In this context, monument building becomes feasible without farming, provided social cohesion is strong. What remains puzzling is the scale. Some monuments required repeated labour over many years. This implies long-term commitment beyond a single gathering. It suggests planning that extended across seasons and lifetimes. Such commitment requires trust in continuity, in the idea that the effort invested now will matter later. This trust in the future is itself a form of knowledge. It reflects an understanding of generational time, of inheritance, of memory beyond the individual. Monuments become anchors in that temporal landscape, fixed points around which stories, rituals, and identities can revolve. When we encounter monuments older than memory should allow, we're really encountering societies that externalized memory before writing existed. Stone circles, alignments, and platforms function as mnemonic devices, encoding information in spatial form. They make time visible. They turn cycles into places. This perspective reframes monuments not as primitive precursors to later architecture, but as sophisticated tools in their own right. They are instruments for organizing social life, coordinating seasonal activities, and reinforcing shared worldviews. Their builders were not simply stacking rocks, they were shaping perception. The global distribution of early monuments also raises questions about independent development versus shared patterns. Similar forms appear in distant regions with no clear contact. Stone circles in Europe, platform mounds in the Americas, cairns in Asia. Each tradition has unique features, but the underlying impulse is familiar. This suggests that once human societies reach certain thresholds of population, knowledge, and stability, monument building becomes a recurring solution to common challenges. How do you remember across generations? How do you gather dispersed groups? How do you align social life with natural cycles? Stone provides one answer. Still, the timing remains difficult to reconcile. Why do these monuments appear when they do, rather than gradually evolving from smaller markers? In some cases, earlier markers may have existed but were made of perishable materials. Wooden posts, earthen mounds, woven symbols. These would vanish quickly, leaving stone as the first visible iteration of a much older practice. If this is true, then the monuments we see are not first attempts but final drafts. They represent the moment when tradition solidified enough to justify the effort of permanence. Everything before that lived in forms that time did not preserve. This aligns with what we see elsewhere. Writing appears suddenly because it externalizes memory that was already being managed orally. Agriculture appears suddenly because ecological knowledge already existed. Monuments appear suddenly because symbolic systems were already mature. What we call sudden may simply be the moment when invisible processes become visible. There is also the issue of selection. Archaeology privileges what survives. Stone monuments survive better than wooden ones. Large structures survive better than small ones. Sites that are reused or buried survive better than those eroded or built over. This creates a distorted picture where only certain expressions of human behaviour remain. As a result, we may be mistaking rarity for novelty. The monuments we see may represent a small fraction of what once existed. Others may lie underwater, beneath modern cities, or erased entirely by erosion. Each discovery expands the known range, suggesting that more waits unseen. Monuments older than memory should allow challenge not only timelines but confidence. They remind us that the human past is deeper and more complex than linear models suggest. They show us that symbolic thought, long-term planning, and collective action did not wait for civilization to begin. They also force us to confront the idea that much of what humans achieved before writing is permanently inaccessible. We can measure stones, we can map alignments, we can analyze construction techniques, but we cannot fully recover meaning. The stories that animated these places are gone, leaving us to infer from form alone. And yet, even without those stories, the monuments still speak. They tell us that humans cared about time, place, and continuity long before history kept score. They tell us that knowledge can exist without being written, that memory can be anchored in landscape, and that societies we once dismissed as simple were capable of thinking far beyond immediate needs. Between the deep, sprawling stretch of prehistory and the recognizable rise of civilization lies a span of time that refuses to sit comfortably in our explanations. It is not empty, it is not brief, yet it often feels oddly compressed, summarized in a few transitional sentences before the story rushes forward into cities, kings, and written records. This is the missing millennia, the long interval where something clearly happened, but where our ability to describe it with confidence fades into uncertainty. When people speak about a gap, it is tempting to imagine a void, as though humanity paused, waiting for the next act to begin. That is not what this period represents. Humans were alive, active, adaptable, and thinking during every moment of it. The gap is not in human experience, it is in our evidence. More precisely, it is in the kind of evidence we rely on most heavily to feel secure in our narratives. The gap stretches roughly from the end of the last major ice age into the earliest phases of settled life, but its exact boundaries shift depending on region. In some places, the transition appears earlier, in others, much later. This alone complicates any attempt to tell a single unified story. There was no global switch that flipped civilization on everywhere at once. Instead, there were many local stories unfolding under broadly similar environmental pressures. One of the most significant changes during this time was climatic. The planet was emerging from a long period of instability. Glaciers that had dominated vast areas began to retreat. Sea levels rose dramatically, swallowing coastlines and reshaping continents. Ecosystems reorganized. Plants and animals expanded into new niches. For humans, this meant opportunity paired with disruption. As ice sheets melted, land bridges disappeared. Regions that had once been connected were cut off. Populations that had mingled were separated. Coastal areas, which had likely supported dense and stable human communities, vanished beneath the sea. Entire cultural landscapes were erased, not metaphorically, but physically. Camps, gathering places, and perhaps even early settlements now lie underwater beyond easy reach. This alone could account for a large portion of what feels missing. If key developments occurred in these drowned regions, they would leave little trace for us to find. Inland sites would then appear to show sudden change, when in reality they are inheriting practices developed elsewhere. At the same time, the newly stable climate allowed experimentation to stick. Practices that might have failed repeatedly during earlier periods could now persist long enough to take root. Seasonal cycles became more predictable. Plant growth patterns stabilized. Animal migrations became more reliable. This predictability does not create knowledge by itself, but it allows knowledge to accumulate without constant interruption. During the missing millennia, humans likely shifted from short-term strategies, optimized for survival under uncertainty, to longer-term strategies that assumed continuity. This is a subtle but profound change. It affects how people plan, how they invest effort, and how they think about the future. Yet planning alone does not explain the coordination we begin to see. Large communal projects, emerging social hierarchies, and shared symbolic systems require trust across time and groups. They require mechanisms for enforcing norms, resolving disputes, and maintaining cohesion beyond immediate kinship. These mechanisms leave very little physical trace. Social contracts are not preserved in soil. Oral agreements decay with memory. Rituals vanish unless tied to durable structures. If new forms of social organisation emerged during this period, they may have been largely invisible archaeologically. This invisibility can create the illusion of suddenness. When the first stone monuments or permanent settlements appear, they seem to come out of nowhere, but they may simply be the first expressions of systems that had already been operating informally. Another factor complicating the picture is mobility. Humans did not stop moving immediately when conditions improved. Many groups likely maintained seasonal rounds, returning to the same places year after year without building permanent structures. Over time, these repeated visits could produce deep familiarity with specific locations, effectively anchoring memory and meaning without fixed architecture. Such places might serve as meeting grounds, ritual sites, or exchange hubs long before becoming villages or towns. The transition from seasonal use to permanent settlement could be gradual in lived experience, even if it appears abrupt in the archaeological record. There is also the question of population dynamics. Small increases in population density can have outsized effects. More people means more interactions, more idea exchange, more pressure on resources, and more incentive to organise. At certain thresholds, social complexity can increase rapidly, not because humans suddenly become more intelligent, but because the network becomes denser. During the missing millennia, population densities were likely increasing slowly but steadily. This would amplify the effects of innovation and make coordination more rewarding. Practices that once benefited only small groups could now scale to larger communities. Knowledge transmission also changes with scale. In very small groups, knowledge is highly personal. In larger groups, it becomes standardized. Shared practices require shared rules. Informal teaching becomes formalized. This process can happen quickly once group size reaches a tipping point. From the outside, it can look like knowledge appears suddenly. From the inside, it feels like a natural adaptation to changing circumstances. Another possibility is that the gap reflects not a single continuous process, but multiple attempts. Human societies may have experimented with settlement, cultivation, or complex organization several times, only to abandon or lose these systems due to environmental stress, conflict, or internal collapse. Each attempt would leave partial traces, easily misinterpreted or overlooked. Over thousands of years, such cycles could compress into a misleadingly short visible transition. What we interpret as a single leap could actually be the successful iteration of many failures. This idea aligns with what we know about later civilizations. Collapse is not rare. Complex societies can unravel quickly when conditions shift. There is no reason to assume early experiments were immune to this fragility. Without writing or durable infrastructure, failed systems could disappear almost completely. The gap may also reflect a bias in what we consider important. Archaeology has traditionally focused on certain markers of complexity: farming, cities, monuments, writing. But complexity can take many forms. A society can be ecologically sophisticated, socially flexible, and symbolically rich without producing any of these markers. If such societies dominated the missing millennia, then our expectations would lead us to overlook them. We would see only continuity of tools and camps, missing the deeper shifts occurring in behavior, belief, and organization. This is particularly relevant when considering ritual and cosmology. Shared worldviews can coordinate action without centralized authority. Seasonal ceremonies can synchronize groups across wide areas. Myths can encode environmental knowledge. None of this requires permanent architecture or written records. If belief systems became more elaborate during the gap, they could lay the groundwork for later monument building and social hierarchy. When these beliefs finally found expression in stone, they would appear fully formed. There is also the role of memory itself. Humans are storytelling creatures. We organize experience into narratives. During periods without writing, those narratives are fluid. They adapt, merge, and change over time. Some stories may preserve accurate information for generations. Others may drift. When writing appears, it freezes narratives. It creates a sharp boundary between before and after. Everything prior becomes prehistory, even if people at the time experience continuity. The gap may therefore be partly conceptual. It is a boundary created by our methods rather than by lived reality. We draw a line where writing begins and treat everything before as fundamentally different, even though the people living through the transition may not have perceived it that way. Still, this does not fully resolve the discomfort. There are real absences, real discontinuities, practices that seem to arrive without obvious ancestors. The missing millennia remain missing not because nothing happened, but because too many things happened in forms that time has been especially good at erasing. What we are left with is a patchwork: environmental data, tool traditions, genetic evidence, settlement patterns. Each offers clues, but none provide a complete picture. The gap persists not as a single mystery, but as an accumulation of small unknowns that refuse to align neatly. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the gap reflects the limits of reconstruction. We are trying to understand societies that did not externalize their complexity in ways that survive well. We are listening for voices that spoke softly and briefly, while stone and soil amplify only certain tones. The missing millennia are not a single lost chapter waiting to be recovered in full. They are a reminder that history, especially deep history, is always incomplete, that what we know is shaped by chance preservation as much as by human action, and that between the first stone tools and the first cities lies not a void, but a crowded, dynamic, and largely invisible world where humans were already preparing, often unknowingly, for changes that would later appear sudden only because we arrived too late to see their beginnings. When people encounter gaps in history, especially gaps as wide and stubborn as the one between deep prehistory and full civilization, the human mind almost instinctively reaches for dramatic explanations. Sudden change invites sudden causes. If complex knowledge appears abruptly, perhaps something erased what came before. If societies seem to restart, perhaps they were reset. This is where the idea of catastrophe enters the conversation, not as fantasy, but as a serious line of inquiry rooted in how fragile human systems actually are. The question is not whether catastrophes happened. They did. The question is whether they were large enough, frequent enough, or disruptive enough to repeatedly break continuity, leaving humanity to rebuild with partial memory, fragmentary knowledge, and altered conditions. And if so, whether what we call the unexplained gap is less about sudden invention and more about survival after loss. Earth's recent geological past was anything but calm. The end of the last ice age was not a gentle warming. It was a period marked by rapid climate shifts, violent weather events, and dramatic environmental reorganization. Temperatures rose, but not smoothly. They spiked, dropped, and spiked again. Massive ice sheets melted unevenly. Meltwater flooded landscapes, redirected rivers, and reshaped coastlines. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over several thousand years, swallowing vast tracts of land where humans had lived for generations. For people living through it, this would not have felt like gradual change. It would have felt like loss. Familiar coastlines disappearing, camps abandoned, migration routes disrupted, resources shifting unpredictably, entire ecosystems transforming within a few human lifetimes. Knowledge tied to specific places would suddenly become useless. Techniques refined over generations might no longer apply. This kind of disruption does not need to kill everyone to erase knowledge. It only needs to break transmission. If elders die, if groups scatter, if traditions lose relevance, accumulated understanding can vanish quickly. In societies without writing, memory is stored in people. When people are lost or displaced, memory goes with them. One of the most compelling candidates for large-scale disruption is rapid sea level rise. During the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were far lower than today. Coastlines extended outward, creating wide continental shelves rich in resources. These areas would have been ideal places to live. Stable food supplies, access to marine life, trade routes along coasts. Archaeological evidence suggests humans favoured such environments wherever they existed. When the ice melted, those landscapes disappeared beneath the sea. Any settlements, ritual sites, or long-used gathering places were submerged. The people who lived there either moved inland or perished. Their material culture vanished into an environment that preserves poorly and remains difficult to study even now. If important developments occurred in these drowned regions, their loss would leave a profound gap. Inland sites would suddenly show new practices with no local ancestors, creating the illusion of abrupt appearance. What we interpret as sudden innovation might actually be migration, inheritance, or adaptation under pressure. Climate instability also affects food systems. A shift in rainfall patterns can collapse established foraging strategies. Animal migrations can change. Plant distributions can move or vanish. In such conditions, societies may be forced to experiment rapidly, adopting new methods not because they are ideal, but because they are necessary. This context makes agriculture look less like a planned improvement and more like a response to stress. Managing plants and animals more intensively could be a way to buffer against unpredictability. If traditional food sources failed, people might turn to cultivation out of necessity rather than preference. There is also evidence for abrupt cooling events during this transitional period, most notably the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions roughly 12,000 years ago. This event lasted over a millennium and would have caused widespread ecological disruption. Just as humans were adapting to warmer conditions, the climate swung back toward cold and dryness. For societies experimenting with new forms of organisation, this would have been devastating. Crops fail, game declines, landscapes change again. Any fragile systems under development could collapse, leaving behind little trace beyond scattered tools and abandoned sites. The Younger Dryas ended abruptly. Temperatures rose quickly, ushering in the stable climate of the Holocene. This sudden stabilisation may have allowed surviving populations to reassemble, carrying fragments of knowledge forward into a more predictable world. From our perspective, it can look like civilization appears suddenly. From theirs, it may have felt like rebuilding. Beyond climate, there is the question of sudden destructive events. Large volcanic eruptions can darken skies, cool climates, and devastate regions. Floods can wipe out entire valleys. Earthquakes can destroy settlements. Even smaller-scale disasters, if frequent enough, can prevent long-term accumulation of infrastructure and knowledge. Myths from many cultures describe floods, fires from the sky, darkness, and world-ending events followed by renewal. While myths are not historical records in the modern sense, they are not meaningless. They encode collective memory, shaped by storytelling rather than chronology. When similar themes appear across widely separated cultures, it raises the possibility that shared experiences, or at least shared types of experience, left a deep psychological imprint. The idea of a great flood, for example, appears in Mesopotamian, biblical, Indian, Chinese, indigenous American, and many other traditions. These stories differ in detail, but they often share a structure. A prior world exists. It is destroyed or cleansed. Survivors rebuild. Knowledge is lost or preserved by a few. This does not mean there was a single global flood. It does suggest that flooding was a powerful and recurring threat, especially during periods of rapid sea level rise. Coastal communities would experience it repeatedly. Rivers would overflow unpredictably. Memory of these events would persist long after specific details faded. Catastrophe, however, is only one side of the question. Forgetting can be just as powerful and far more subtle. Even without dramatic disasters, knowledge can fade when it is no longer needed. Skills tied to specific environments may lose relevance when people move. Social structures may dissolve when population density changes. Rituals may lose meaning when belief systems shift. Over generations, what is not reinforced disappears. Forgetting does not require collapse. It can happen gradually, as new practices replace old ones. In this sense, the reset may not be external at all. It may be cultural. When humans adopt new ways of living, they often abandon older ones deliberately. Mobile societies that settle permanently must change their values. Flexibility gives way to predictability. Shared access to resources gives way to ownership. New rules replace old customs. In the process, older knowledge may be devalued, suppressed, or simply ignored. This is especially true when new systems reward different skills. Agricultural societies value planning, storage, and land management. They may no longer prioritize deep knowledge of wide-ranging ecosystems. Navigation skills tied to long-distance movement may become less relevant. Oral traditions tied to mobility may fragment when communities settle. Within a few generations, entire bodies of knowledge can become irrelevant. Without use, they disappear. Later societies may not even be aware that such knowledge existed. There is also the psychological effect of writing itself. Once information is recorded externally, memory practices change. People rely less on internal recall. Oral traditions shift. What is written gains authority. What is not written becomes suspect or forgotten. This creates a sharp divide. Everything before writing feels less real, less reliable, less complete. We call it prehistory, not because it lacks history, but because it lacks text. This framing can make earlier knowledge seem absent rather than simply undocumented. From this perspective, the reset may be partly a product of how we define knowledge. What survives in stone and text is treated as real. What lived in practice and memory is treated as speculative. Over time, this bias hardens into narrative. The question then becomes not whether humanity was reset, but how many times continuity was interrupted, redirected, or redefined. Some interruptions may have been dramatic, others quiet. Together they create a jagged pattern rather than a smooth curve. What makes this particularly relevant is how often human societies later in history experience similar resets. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to loss of infrastructure, literacy, and technical knowledge in parts of Europe. Complex systems unraveled quickly. Skills persisted unevenly. Centuries later, people rediscovered techniques that had once been common. If such loss can occur in literate societies with stone cities and written records, it is far easier to imagine in societies without those supports. A single prolonged disruption could erase generations of accumulated understanding. Seen this way, the unexplained gap is less mysterious. It is not a single missing event, but a pattern of loss and recovery compressed by time and preservation bias. Civilization appears suddenly, not because it emerged from nothing, but because it is the first form of complexity that reliably leaves durable evidence. Catastrophe and forgetting are not mutually exclusive. They reinforce each other. Disruption accelerates forgetting. Forgetting weakens resilience against future disruption. Over long periods, this cycle can repeat many times. What remains visible to us are the moments when the cycle stabilizes long enough for systems to externalize themselves in stone, agriculture, and writing. Everything before that exists in fragments, shadows, and echoes. The reset, if it happened, was not a single switch being flipped. It was a slow erasure punctuated by sudden shocks, followed by rebuilding with whatever survived. Humanity did not start over from zero, but it rarely carried everything forward intact. And within that fragile process lies the real mystery. Not what was lost in one catastrophic moment, but how much human knowledge has always lived on the edge of forgetting, waiting for conditions stable enough to finally leave marks that time could not easily erase. Marks that we now mistake for beginnings simply because they are the first things we can still see. When written records fall silent and material traces thin out, one form of evidence remains stubbornly present across cultures and continents. Stories, myths, narratives passed from one generation to the next, reshaped by language and belief, but anchored to something that mattered enough to remember. For a long time, modern scholarship treated these stories as imaginative inventions, symbolic at best, unreliable at worst. Yet as archaeology, climatology, and anthropology have matured, myths have begun to look less like fantasies and more like distorted reflections, echoes of experiences that once carried real weight. This does not mean myths are literal historical accounts. They're not newspapers from the past. They are memory under pressure, compressed, moralized, ritualized, and adapted to survive without writing. And that makes them particularly valuable when we are trying to understand periods where other forms of memory failed. Across the world, remarkably similar themes appear again and again. Floods that destroy an earlier world, teachers who arrive after disaster to restore knowledge, a previous age that was closer to the gods, more ordered, or more complete. Survivors who rebuild using fragments of what was lost. These patterns are too widespread to dismiss as coincidence, yet too varied to point to a single event. What they suggest instead is something subtler: repeated disruption, repeated loss, repeated rebuilding. Flood myths are the most obvious place to begin. They appear in Mesopotamia, where the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned of a deluge that would wipe out humanity. They appear in the Hebrew Bible with Noah, in India, where Manu is warned by a fish, in China, where great floods threaten civilization itself, in the Americas, where indigenous traditions describe waters covering the land and reshaping the world, in Australia, in Africa, in island cultures scattered across the Pacific. These stories differ in detail, but their structure is familiar. There is a world that exists before. There is a transgression, imbalance, or turning point. Water comes. The old order is erased. A few survive. From them, a new world begins. It is tempting to look for a single global flood that explains them all. That approach rarely holds up under scrutiny. What does hold up is the reality that flooding was a dominant and repeated threat during the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose rapidly, rivers changed course, meltwater floods were catastrophic on regional scales. For coastal and riverine societies, flooding would have been the most dramatic, memorable, and destructive force they encountered. Memory of such events would persist. Over generations, specific locations and timelines would blur, but the emotional core would remain. Water destroys the old world. Survival depends on foresight, warning, or favour. Knowledge is preserved by a few and passed on. In this sense, flood myths may not be records of a single event, but a cultural shorthand for loss on a scale large enough to break continuity. They encode the idea that the world can change suddenly, that stability is fragile, and that what came before can vanish. Alongside floods, another recurring figure appears: the teacher. In many traditions, after catastrophe, or at the beginning of a new age, knowledge is restored by beings who already possess it. They are often described as civilizers, culture heroes, or divine messengers. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu, wise beings who teach humanity arts and sciences. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, associated with learning, agriculture, and order. In the Andes, Viracocha, who brings civilization after a flood. In ancient Egypt, Thoth, keeper of knowledge. In Polynesian traditions, figures who arrive by sea carrying skills and rules. These teachers rarely invent knowledge from scratch. They restore it. They remind. They reorganize. They bring order back into a world that has fallen into chaos. This framing is important. It suggests memory of a prior state where knowledge already existed. Again, this does not require literal outsiders arriving with advanced technology. It can be understood socially. After disruption, certain individuals or groups retain fragments of older knowledge. Elders, specialists, survivors. When conditions stabilize, these people become sources of authority. Their knowledge feels ancient because it is older than the rebuilt society around them. Myth transforms these dynamics into narrative. Teachers become gods or demigods. Knowledge becomes sacred. Restoration becomes creation. There is also the recurring idea of a lost golden age, a time before the present world, often described as more harmonious, longer lived or closer to cosmic order. Hesiod's Ages of Man, the Hindu Yugas, indigenous stories of earlier peoples who lived differently. These are not historical chronologies. They are reflections on change, on decline, on the sense that something valuable has slipped away. In societies that experienced repeated disruption, this feeling would be grounded in lived experience. Skills forgotten, places lost, landscapes transformed, stories of earlier abundance would circulate, not as precise memories, but as emotional truths. One of the most striking features of myth as memory is how it encodes knowledge indirectly. Environmental hazards become monsters, seasonal cycles become gods, astronomical patterns become stories of celestial beings. This is not ignorance, it is compression. It allows complex information to survive in a form that can be remembered, repeated, and adapted. For example, a flood myth may encode not just the idea of water, but when and where flooding occurs, which areas are dangerous, and the importance of preparation. A story about a teacher arriving after chaos may reinforce the value of listening to elders and preserving knowledge during times of change. In oral societies, myth is not entertainment. It is infrastructure. It organizes memory in the absence of writing. When we dismiss it entirely, we risk discarding one of the few bridges left across the gap. This becomes especially relevant when myths appear to preserve knowledge that seems out of place for their time. Ancient stories that describe stars not visible from current latitudes, myths that reference landscapes now underwater, narratives that imply long observation of cycles spanning centuries. These details may not be precise, but they hint at deep temporal awareness. Consider the way many cultures link important sites to cosmology: sacred mountains, world trees, axis mundi. These are not arbitrary symbols. They reflect attempts to orient human life within a larger order. When monuments later encode similar alignments physically, it suggests continuity between symbolic memory and material expression. Another important aspect is what myths choose to remember and what they allow to fade. They often focus on transitions, beginnings, endings, catastrophes, teachings. They are less concerned with everyday continuity. This mirrors the archaeological record, where dramatic changes are easier to see than long stability. As a result, myth can exaggerate rupture while downplaying gradual adaptation. This can make the past feel more broken than it was. Yet even exaggeration tells us something. It tells us what felt significant enough to remember. When civilizations emerge with complex systems that seem to appear suddenly, myths may be one of the few places where earlier phases are acknowledged, albeit indirectly. The story says, "This is not the first world." That statement alone is revealing. There is also the uncomfortable realization that myths often preserve memory better than institutions. Written records can be lost, destroyed, or censored. Oral traditions adapt and survive. They can carry core ideas across immense spans of time, even as surface details change. Anthropological studies have shown that some oral traditions preserve accurate information about events thousands of years old, such as volcanic eruptions or sea level changes, embedded in symbolic language. This does not mean every myth is a historical document, but it does mean dismissing them entirely as a mistake. When we view myths as memory rather than fiction, the unexplained gap begins to look different. Instead of a silence, it becomes a murmur. Instead of absence, distortion. Instead of invention, inheritance reshaped by loss. The recurring themes of floods, teachers, and earlier worlds suggest that people living in early civilizations were not unaware of what came before. They felt themselves to be inheritors, not originators. Their stories placed them after something, not at the beginning of everything. This aligns with archaeological evidence showing that many early civilizations situate themselves within landscapes already shaped by long human presence. They build atop older sites. They reuse sacred locations. They integrate pre-existing symbols. Civilization does not wipe the slate clean. It builds on what remains. Myths, then, may serve as bridges across resets. They preserve identity through change. They explain why the world looks the way it does. They justify new structures while acknowledging loss. The echo of an earlier world does not require a vanished global empire. It requires something much more ordinary and much more human. Time, disruption, memory, forgetting, and the stubborn need to explain where we came from when the evidence no longer speaks clearly. Myths are not answers. They are signals. They tell us that people sensed continuity beyond what they could fully explain. They tell us that loss was remembered, not erased. And they remind us that when the material record falls silent, humans do not stop remembering. They simply remember differently, carrying fragments of the past forward in stories that whisper of floods survived, knowledge restored, and worlds that existed just far enough back to be felt, but not fully recalled. When people speak about ancient knowledge, the conversation often drifts toward exaggeration or dismissal. Either the past is credited with impossible technologies, or it is stripped of any serious competence beyond what feels comfortable. What makes ancient maps, alignments, and measurements so unsettling is that they resist both extremes. They are real, they are measurable, and they often sit just far enough outside expected capability to create unease rather than certainty. The problem is not that ancient people knew nothing. It is that in several cases they appear to have known too much, too early, and with a consistency that implies long observation rather than sudden inspiration. These instances do not stand alone. They cluster. They echo one another across regions and cultures, and taken together, they point toward accumulated knowledge whose origins are difficult to locate within our standard timelines. Maps are a good place to begin, because they force clarity. A map either corresponds to geography or it does not. Interpretation matters, but scale, orientation, and proportional accuracy can be tested. When ancient maps depict coastlines, distances, or relationships that align unexpectedly well with real-world geography, questions naturally follow. One of the most frequently discussed examples is the Piri Reis map, created in the early 16th century by an Ottoman admiral. On its own, it is not prehistoric, but what makes it relevant is the source material Piri Reis claimed to use. He wrote that his map was compiled from much older charts, some inherited from ancient sources. Portions of the map appear to show parts of the South American coastline with notable accuracy. More controversially, some have argued that it depicts ice-free Antarctic coastlines, though this claim remains debated. What matters here is not whether every controversial interpretation holds up. It is that ancient and medieval map makers were often working from inherited knowledge rather than direct exploration. They compiled, copied, and refined information accumulated over long periods. If some of that information originated far earlier than we assume, it would be difficult to detect without surviving originals. Other ancient maps, less famous but equally intriguing, show sophisticated understanding of regional geography. Babylonian maps depict the world in symbolic form, but also encode spatial relationships. Ancient Chinese maps demonstrate advanced cartographic techniques early on, including grid systems and scale distances. Mesoamerican codices map landscapes in ways that combine geography, ritual, and political knowledge. These are not naive sketches, they are tools, and tools reflect practice. Mapping requires repeated movement through space, reliable landmarks, and shared conventions. It also requires agreement. A map is meaningless unless others understand how to read it. This implies standardization and continuity. It implies knowledge passed down, corrected, and maintained. What becomes unsettling is when that continuity appears longer than our timelines allow. Accurate mapping does not emerge from a single journey. It emerges from generations of travel, comparison, and memory. When early civilizations already possess functional mapping traditions, it suggests they inherited frameworks rather than invented them fully formed. Alignments deepen the problem. Across the world, ancient structures align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, stellar risings. This is not controversial. It is well documented. What is more difficult to explain is how consistently these alignments appear in cultures separated by vast distances, and how precisely they were executed with minimal technology. Aligning a structure to a solstice requires more than noticing the sun once. It requires observing the horizon year after year, marking extreme points, averaging variation, and distinguishing meaningful patterns from noise. Lunar cycles are even more demanding. The moon's extreme positions repeat on an 18.6-year cycle. Tracking that requires patience across generations. Yet stone circles, temples, mounds, and platforms across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas encode these cycles with surprising accuracy. Some alignments are subtle, visible only at specific moments. Others are dramatic, producing light and shadow effects that depend on precise orientation. This kind of accuracy cannot be improvised. It requires long-term observation, shared record-keeping, and disciplined transmission of knowledge. The alignments are the final expression. The work that made them possible is invisible. What makes this especially relevant to the unexplained gap is timing. Many of these alignments appear early in the archaeological record of monument building. They do not gradually improve from rough approximations to precision. They appear precise from the beginning. This mirrors patterns seen elsewhere. Writing systems appear functional early. Agriculture appears organized early. Monumental architecture appears confident early. In each case, the visible product does not show its apprenticeship. Measurements present a similar challenge. Across ancient sites, standard units appear again and again, lengths that repeat, ratios that remain consistent, proportions that suggest intentional design rather than chance. Some of these units align closely with human body dimensions, which makes sense. Others appear abstract, implying agreed conventions beyond individual builders. In ancient Egypt, the cubit was standardized early, subdivided into smaller units with precision. Construction accuracy in pyramids and temples is extraordinary, especially considering the scale. Angles remain consistent. Cardinal alignment is remarkably exact. Deviations are minimal even by modern standards. Achieving this requires more than craftsmanship. It requires measurement systems that can be reproduced reliably. It requires training. It requires oversight. And it requires trust that measurements taken today will match those taken years later by different people. Again, the question arises, where did these systems come from? Measurement does not appear in a vacuum. It emerges from repeated need, from trade, from construction, from administration, from shared expectations. When early civilizations already operate with standardized measurement, it suggests the conceptual groundwork existed beforehand. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. In the Indus Valley, brick dimensions are standardized across vast areas. In Mesoamerica, architectural proportions repeat across sites separated by distance and time. In Andean construction, stone fitting achieves extraordinary precision without mortar, relying on consistent shaping principles. None of this requires lost super technology. It requires continuity, time, repetition, feedback. What becomes difficult is fitting that continuity into a compressed timeline. If the missing millennia were a period of experimentation, observation, and gradual standardization, we would expect to see traces of that process. In many cases, we do not. Instead, we see results. One explanation, as before, is preservation bias. Measurement systems exist largely in practice. Unless recorded in writing or encoded in durable architecture, they leave little trace. A measuring rod made of wood disappears. A teacher demonstrating proportions leaves nothing behind. What remains are the buildings themselves. Maps and alignments suffer from the same issue. The act of mapping or observing the sky leaves no direct artifact. Only the outcome survives. This creates a deceptive effect. Knowledge seems to appear fully formed because only its final expressions are visible. The long period of refinement lives entirely in lost practices. There is also the possibility that some knowledge survived through cultural bottlenecks. After disruption, small groups may preserve specific skills while losing others. When conditions stabilize, those preserved skills can be scaled rapidly. This can produce sudden sophistication without gradual build-up in the visible record. For example, if a small group retains astronomical observation traditions while others do not, and that group later becomes influential, their knowledge may suddenly shape architecture and ritual widely. To outsiders, it appears as a leap. To insiders, it is inheritance. This perspective aligns with the role of specialists. Even in small societies, certain individuals focus on specific domains: navigation, astronomy, ritual timing, construction. Their knowledge may not be shared broadly. If their line persists, the knowledge persists. If it breaks, it vanishes. This fragility makes ancient knowledge uneven. Some domains advance while others stagnate or reset. Over time, this produces patchwork sophistication that defies linear expectations. Ancient maps, alignments, and measurements may therefore represent survivor knowledge, skills that endured disruption and found new expression when material conditions allowed. There is also a psychological factor. Once writing and centralized authority emerge, knowledge becomes codified. What can be written feels real. What cannot feels speculative. This biases interpretation. Early knowledge that remained oral or embodied is discounted, even when its results are clearly visible. When we see an ancient structure aligned to a solstice, we accept the alignment but often hesitate to credit the depth of observation required. When we see accurate mapping, we attribute it to coincidence or later copying. When we see precise measurement, we focus on tools rather than systems. This caution is understandable, but it can become its own blind spot. The recurring theme across these domains is not impossibility, it is mismatch. The knowledge fits human capability, but not the compressed narrative we often prefer. It fits long observation, but not sudden invention. It fits continuity, but not clear documentation. This is exactly what we would expect if much of the preparatory work occurred during the missing millennia, a long period of quiet refinement, of watching, measuring, remembering, teaching, forgetting, recovering. When civilization finally externalizes knowledge in stone, text, and geometry, it does so with confidence. That confidence does not come from nowhere. It comes from familiarity. Ancient maps, alignments, and measurements are not evidence of a lost advanced civilization in the sensational sense. They are evidence of patience, of attention, of humans who lived long enough with the world to notice its patterns and cared enough to preserve them, even when preservation meant nothing more than repeating a story, aligning a stone or teaching a gesture. As we move forward, this perspective will help ground the discussion. The unexplained gap is not filled with miracles. It is filled with time, with observation, with fragile transmission, with knowledge that did not need writing to exist but did need stability to become visible. What appears impossible often becomes reasonable once we stop asking how it was invented so quickly and start asking how long it might have been practiced quietly before anyone thought to leave behind something that could still speak to us now. When historians describe the rise of civilization, they often speak as if it followed a familiar human pattern: birth, growth, maturity. Yet when you look closely at the evidence, something feels off. Civilization does not stumble, fall, and slowly learn to walk. It does not babble incoherently before forming clear sentences. It does not show us a long, awkward childhood full of mistakes and half-formed attempts. Instead, when it becomes visible, it already knows how to stand upright. Cities appear with planned layouts. Agriculture arrives with calendars and storage. Writing begins with functional systems capable of administration. Monumental architecture emerges with geometry, alignment and coordination. Measurement is standardized. Rituals are formalized. Hierarchies exist. Nothing about this looks like a toddler taking its first steps. This absence of a visible childhood is one of the most unsettling aspects of early civilization, not because it implies something supernatural, but because it contradicts how complex systems usually develop. In biology, technology, language, and even modern institutions, early stages are messy. They leave behind failed versions, crude prototypes, inefficient experiments. We expect to see false starts. Yet when civilization enters the record, false starts are surprisingly hard to find. This does not mean they never existed. It means they did not survive in ways we can easily recognize. To understand why civilization appears fully grown, we have to reconsider what we mean by childhood in this context. A childhood is not simply a period of time. It is a period where learning happens visibly, where mistakes are externalized, where growth is uneven and often inefficient. For civilization to have a childhood, that learning would need to leave durable traces. But most learning does not. For tens of thousands of years before cities, humans were already learning how to coordinate, how to share information, how to track cycles, how to manage resources, and how to maintain social order. They were doing so without writing, without permanent structures, without centralized institutions. Their learning lived in behavior, not in artifacts. This is the core of the problem. Civilization's childhood did not happen in stone or ink. It happened in people. Social skills are learned internally and collectively. You do not leave behind a fossil of conflict resolution. You do not preserve a record of how trust develops between groups. You cannot excavate negotiation. And yet, without these skills, civilization cannot function. Before any city could exist, humans had to learn how to live in close proximity without constant violence. They had to learn how to resolve disputes beyond kinship. They had to learn how to coordinate labor among people who were not immediate family. These are not trivial abilities. They are among the most complex challenges any social species faces. Hunter-gatherer societies, despite their small size, already solved many of these problems. They developed norms, taboos, reciprocal obligations, and systems of reputation. These systems were flexible, adaptable, and deeply embedded in daily life. They required constant reinforcement through interaction rather than enforcement through law. When population density increased, these same skills scaled up. They did not need to be invented anew. They needed to be reorganized. This is why civilization does not show us its early mistakes. Its early learning happened at a social scale that leaves no durable footprint. The same applies to ecological knowledge. Before agriculture, humans spent thousands of generations learning how landscapes respond to intervention. They burned fields selectively. They harvested in ways that encouraged regrowth. They tracked animal behavior. They understood soil, water, and seasonality at a local level with extraordinary precision. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was embodied. It lived in timing, habit, and attention. When agriculture emerged, it drew directly from this foundation. People already knew when to plant, when to harvest, where water pooled, and which species thrived together. The visible agricultural record begins when these practices become fixed and intensified. What came before was flexible, mobile, and therefore archaeologically faint. The childhood exists, but it does not fossilize. Writing offers another example. The earliest writing systems do not look like children learning to scribble. They look like accounting tools, lists, tallies, ownership marks, administrative records. Writing appears because someone already understands what needs to be recorded. Before writing, humans relied on memory systems, oral traditions, ritual repetition, physical tokens, body-based counting, spatial markers. These systems are sophisticated, but they vanish unless intentionally preserved. When writing replaces them, it does so abruptly in the archaeological record, making it appear as though literacy was born fully formed. In reality, writing is not the beginning of symbolic communication. It is the moment when symbolic communication becomes externalized and permanent. Architecture follows the same pattern. Monumental construction does not begin with random stacking of stones. It begins with designs that already work. This implies prior experience with space, structure, and load, likely developed through perishable materials like wood and earth. Wooden buildings do not survive for millennia. Earthworks erode. Tents leave nothing. Entire architectural traditions can vanish without trace, leaving stone as the first visible expression of an already mature understanding of structure. The absence of architectural childhood is therefore a matter of material survival, not sudden competence. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Humans do not perceive continuity the way archaeology does. For the people living through these transitions, nothing may have felt sudden. Practices evolved gradually within living memory. Children learned what their parents practiced. Innovations were incremental. The sense of rupture appears only when we compress thousands of years into a timeline. Civilization has no childhood because we are looking at it from too far away. Imagine observing a human life only through photographs taken once every 10 years. Childhood would appear compressed. Growth would seem sudden. Skills would appear fully formed. The gaps between images would hide the learning. Deep history works the same way. Our snapshots are sparse. We miss the process. This perspective also explains why early civilizations often describe themselves as inheritors rather than inventors. They situate their origins in mythic pasts, golden ages, or divine instruction. This is not false modesty. It reflects lived experience. People did not feel as though they were inventing civilization from nothing. They felt as though they were organizing what already existed. The idea of a lost earlier world appears again and again because cultural memory recognizes continuity even when physical evidence does not. Another factor is selective survival. The earlier civilizations we recognize are the ones that succeeded. Failed experiments leave fewer traces. A settlement that collapses after a few generations may leave little behind. A system that persists leaves monuments, records, and ruins. This creates a survivorship bias. We see the winners, not the attempts. If early humans tried and failed to establish permanent settlements multiple times, we may only see the final, successful iteration. Its competence reflects accumulated learning, including lessons learned from failure that left no visible mark. Civilization therefore looks mature not because it was born that way, but because immature forms did not last long enough to be remembered. There is also the role of threshold effects. Many complex systems behave quietly until they reach a tipping point. Once crossed, change accelerates. Below the threshold, progress is slow and reversible. Above it, it becomes self-reinforcing. Population density is one such threshold. Surplus production is another. Stable climate is another. When these factors align, complexity can scale rapidly. From within the system, this feels like momentum. From outside, it looks like sudden emergence. This helps explain why early civilizations appear simultaneously complex across multiple domains. Once a threshold is crossed, agriculture supports specialists. Specialists improve tools. Tools enable architecture. Architecture reinforces social hierarchy. Writing stabilizes administration. Each element strengthens the others. There is no childhood phase because the system locks together quickly once conditions allow. What remains unsettling is not that civilization appears grown, but that we are conditioned to expect growth to always leave visible traces. Human learning does not obey that expectation. Most learning is internal, social and fragile. The gap between prehistory and civilization is not the absence of development. It is the absence of durable records of development. This understanding does not diminish the achievement of early civilizations. It reframes it. It suggests that what appears as sudden brilliance is actually the visible surface of a very long process. Civilization did not skip childhood. It simply grew up in a place where its early years could not be easily preserved. Civilization has no childhood, not because humans changed overnight, but because most of what taught them how to build cities, track time, manage resources and live together happened quietly, repeatedly, and in ways that time was exceptionally good at erasing. What remains is not the beginning of the story, but the first part that learned how to stay. Not everything that shapes the present announces where it came from. Some influences arrive quietly, woven so thoroughly into everyday life that they stop feeling inherited at all. They feel natural, obvious, inevitable. When we look at early civilization, especially at how complete it appears when it first comes into view, one possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. A great deal of what those societies relied on may not have been invented by them in the moment, but received, adapted, and carried forward without a clear awareness of its deeper origin. Inheritance does not require conscious memory. It does not require written acknowledgement or even understanding. Skills, habits, assumptions, and frameworks can pass from one generation to the next simply because they work. Over time, their origins fade, leaving only the practice itself. In this way, entire systems of knowledge can survive while their beginnings disappear completely. This idea changes how we look at the unexplained gap. Instead of asking only what was lost, we can also ask what survived unnoticed. Consider how humans relate to time. Early civilizations did not invent timekeeping from nothing. They formalized it. Calendars appear early, already structured around solar years, lunar months, agricultural cycles, and ritual observances. These systems require long observation. They require knowing when seasons shift, when floods come, when animals migrate, when plants mature. None of this knowledge appears suddenly in the archaeological record. It appears already organized. The act of turning observation into a calendar is an act of inheritance. The observations themselves must predate the system. Generations had to notice patterns, test them, correct them, and trust them. When early civilizations begin naming months and fixing festivals, they are not discovering the sky for the first time. They are formalizing relationships with it that already existed. The same applies to spatial awareness. Many early settlements and monuments demonstrate sophisticated understanding of landscape. They are placed strategically, near water sources, trade routes, fertile land, defensible positions, or symbolic features like mountains and rivers. This placement is not random. It reflects accumulated geographic knowledge. People knew where floods would reach. They knew which soils were productive. They knew which routes were reliable across seasons. That knowledge did not emerge overnight. It was inherited through repeated use and shared memory, long before it was ever expressed in stone walls or city plans. Even social organization shows signs of inheritance. Hierarchies appear early, but hierarchy itself is not new. Prehistoric societies already had forms of leadership, influence and authority. Elders, skilled individuals, ritual specialists. What changes with civilization is not the existence of leadership, but its fixation. Roles that were once fluid become permanent. Authority that was situational becomes institutional. These shifts build on existing social instincts rather than replacing them. Humans did not need to learn how to follow or coordinate. They needed to decide who would do so consistently. Ritual provides another window. Early civilizations are rich in ceremony, symbolism, and sacred spaces. Temples appear alongside cities, not after long periods of purely practical development. This suggests that ritual life was already deeply integrated into human existence. Ritual does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows from shared meaning, repetition, and emotional reinforcement. It encodes values, histories, and cosmologies. When early civilizations formalize ritual architecture and priestly roles, they are likely drawing from much older traditions that were once enacted in temporary spaces, natural features, or seasonal gatherings. What changes is durability, not essence. Language itself carries inheritance invisibly. Early writing systems encode spoken languages that were already complex. Grammar, metaphor, abstraction, and narrative structure predate writing by tens of thousands of years. When writing appears, it captures a snapshot of something already mature. This means that many conceptual frameworks embedded in early texts likely originated far earlier. Ideas about order, chaos, balance, justice, kinship, and the cosmos did not need to be invented by scribes. They needed to be recorded. Writing gives the illusion of beginnings because it marks the first time ideas become fixed. But fixation is not creation. Technology too reflects inherited thinking. Tools used in early civilizations often look like refinements rather than revolutions. Stone tools give way to metal ones, but the underlying principles remain. Cutting, shaping, joining, levering. These are continuities of technique and thought. Even metallurgy, often framed as a dramatic leap, builds on earlier experience with fire, heat control, material properties, and transformation. People who learned to harden clay, produce pigments, or process resins already understood that materials could be altered intentionally. Metalworking extends that logic rather than inventing it. Agriculture, as explored earlier, is perhaps the clearest case. Farming appears structured because it builds on long-standing ecological knowledge. Plant domestication looks sudden because the trial and error phase was spread thin across time and space, leaving few traces. What survives is the moment when inheritance becomes systematized. The same pattern appears in animal management. Domestication requires understanding behavior, breeding cycles, and long-term consequences. Early pastoral societies demonstrate this understanding almost immediately. The knowledge did not come from nowhere. It came from long familiarity with animals as prey, companions, and environmental indicators. Navigation is another inherited domain. Long before maps were drawn, humans moved across vast territories. They crossed seas, deserts, and mountain ranges. They did so using stars, winds, currents, landmarks, and memory. When later civilizations produce charts, star lists, or directional systems, they are externalizing navigational knowledge that already worked. What is inherited here is not just information, but confidence. The confidence that the world can be read, predicted, and traversed. That confidence does not arise suddenly. It is earned through survival. Even mathematics shows signs of inheritance. Early numerical systems often relate to the body, fingers, joints, steps. These counting methods are ancient. When early civilizations formalized numbers for trade, construction, and administration, they build on embodied counting practices that were already intuitive. Geometry, too, emerges from lived experience. Measuring land, dividing resources, aligning structures. These activities require spatial reasoning that develops long before it is written down. The first diagrams are not the first time humans thought geometrically. They are the first time geometry was externalized. Inheritance without awareness also explains why early civilizations often attribute their knowledge to gods, ancestors, or mythic figures. When the true origins of knowledge are lost to time, attribution fills the gap. Saying, "this was taught" is often more accurate than saying "this was invented," even if the teacher becomes symbolic. From the inside, this feels natural. People do not experience themselves as inventing fundamental aspects of reality. They experience themselves as continuing a way of life. The sense of novelty is far stronger in hindsight than it was in lived experience. This perspective also helps explain why some knowledge appears unevenly distributed. Certain regions show advanced understanding in specific domains while lacking in others. Inheritance is selective. What survives depends on context, need, and continuity. A group may preserve astronomical knowledge while losing metallurgical skills. Another may maintain agricultural expertise while forgetting navigational routes. Over time, these fragments recombine in new ways. Civilization becomes a mosaic of inherited pieces assembled under new constraints. It is also important to recognize that inheritance does not imply accuracy or perfection. Knowledge degrades, errors accumulate, practices drift. What is passed on is what remains useful enough to keep. This means inherited systems can be flawed, approximate, or symbolic rather than precise. Calendars drift, myths distort, measurements vary, yet the underlying structure persists. Humans adapt inherited frameworks to new circumstances, sometimes without realizing how old those frameworks are. This process continues today. Many modern practices have origins that predate our awareness. Language carries assumptions older than nations. Legal concepts echo customs shaped by long-forgotten conditions. Social norms persist even when their original purpose is gone. In this sense, civilization did not mark the beginning of inheritance. It marked a change in how inheritance is stored. External memory reduces loss but increases rigidity. What is written can persist longer, but it can also freeze ideas that once adapted fluidly. Before writing, inheritance was dynamic. It changed subtly with each retelling, each teaching, each application. That flexibility allowed survival under shifting conditions, but it left little behind. When we look back at the unexplained gap with this in mind, it begins to look less like a mystery of missing brilliance and more like a mismatch between how humans learn and how history preserves. Much of what early civilizations relied on may have been old even to them. They stood on foundations they did not lay, using tools they did not invent, guided by patterns they inherited without names. This does not diminish their achievements. It situates them within a longer human story, one where continuity mattered more than originality, and survival mattered more than documentation. What we may have inherited without knowing is not lost technology or secret blueprint, but a deep reservoir of ways of seeing, organizing, and responding to the world. Ways that evolved slowly, quietly, and collectively, long before stone monuments or written words announced their presence. There is a moment that arrives quietly when you spend enough time looking backward, a moment where the past stops feeling like a sequence of events and starts feeling more like a landscape. Not a flat one, but layered, uneven, shaped by erosion as much as by construction. Some parts stand tall and obvious, others sink low, softened until their outlines blur. And when you find yourself standing at the edge of that landscape, looking across it, you begin to realize that what we call history is not simply what happened, but what managed to remain visible long enough to be noticed. This is where we are now, standing between what was and what we remember. The journey through the unexplained gap, through stone tools that appear too precise, monuments that arrive too early, agriculture that seems to skip its rehearsal, and myths that whisper about earlier worlds, does not lead to a single answer waiting patiently at the end. Instead, it brings us to a perspective shift, one that asks us to reconsider how continuity actually works across deep time. Human history, especially before writing, was not a straight line. It was a braided stream. Knowledge split, rejoined, pooled, evaporated and flowed again. Some strands ran deep and steady. Others disappeared underground for long stretches before resurfacing somewhere unexpected. When we trace the visible channels and find gaps, it is tempting to assume nothing flowed there at all. But rivers do not stop existing simply because they move out of sight. The absence of a clear record between prehistory and civilization does not mean humanity paused. It means humanity moved in ways that did not leave the kinds of marks we are most comfortable reading. What becomes clear, after lingering with this question long enough, is that civilization did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from familiarity. Familiarity with landscapes, cycles, materials, and social life, refined over immense spans of time. When those familiar patterns finally found durable expression in stone, text, agriculture, and cities, they appeared confident because they were. The idea that civilization has no childhood stops feeling unsettling once we recognize where that childhood actually took place. It was not written down. It was not built to last. It unfolded in voices, gestures, seasonal movement, shared attention, and repeated practice. It lived where time is least forgiving. That realization carries an uncomfortable implication. Most of what shaped early human understanding is permanently inaccessible to us. Not hidden, not waiting to be discovered, but genuinely gone. Eroded coastlines, decayed tools, extinct languages, broken lines of teaching. The gap is not something we will simply fill in one day with a lucky excavation or a single theory that ties everything neatly together. And yet something remains. It remains in patterns that repeat where they should not, in alignments that imply long watching, in systems that arrive already working, in myths that refuse to forget loss, in the quiet sense shared across cultures that the present world is not the first version of itself. Standing here, between what was and what we remember, means accepting that history is incomplete by nature. It is not a failure of research. It is a condition of time. Bone breaks, wood rots, earth shifts, memory fades, writing delays loss, but it does not prevent it. Even the civilizations that left us libraries and monuments lost vast amounts of their own knowledge along the way. We know this because we have records of them lamenting it. What we call prehistory simply extends that condition further back, into a time when memory relied entirely on living continuity. When that continuity broke, knowledge went with it. This understanding changes how we relate to the past. It invites humility. Not the humility of assuming ancient people knew nothing, but the humility of recognizing how much they knew that we will never fully recover. It also changes how we relate to the present, because the same processes are still at work. Knowledge today feels permanent because it is stored redundantly, digitally, globally. But permanence is an illusion. Formats become obsolete. Systems fail. Context disappears. Skills atrophy when not practiced. Assumptions outlive their usefulness. Even now, inheritance happens without awareness, and forgetting happens quietly. Future historians, if they exist, will face their own gaps. They will misinterpret some things. They will overemphasize what survived and underestimate what mattered most. This does not diminish the value of trying to understand the past. It clarifies its limits. The unexplained gap between prehistory and civilization is not a flaw in the human story. It is a reminder of how that story is told, loudly by stone and text, softly by everything else. When we notice that early civilizations positioned themselves as inheritors rather than originators, when they spoke of earlier ages, lost knowledge, divine instruction, or restoration after chaos, we should take that self-understanding seriously, not literally but structurally. They did not feel as though they were beginning from zero. They felt as though they were picking up pieces. That feeling likely came from lived continuity, from elders who remembered different ways, from rituals that preserved older patterns, from landscapes that carried traces of previous use, from myths that encoded memory where explanation was no longer possible. Standing between what was and what we remember also means resisting the urge to replace uncertainty with certainty too quickly. It is tempting to fill gaps with dramatic stories, advanced lost civilizations, or singular catastrophic events that explain everything at once. These ideas appeal because they give shape to absence, but absence does not need a single cause. It often results from accumulation, from thousands of small losses rather than one great one, from the slow mismatch between how humans live and how evidence survives. The quieter explanation is often the more unsettling one, that humanity has always been capable, observant, adaptive, and thoughtful, that those qualities existed long before civilization, and that they expressed themselves in ways that did not prioritize permanence. If there is something profound to take from this exploration, it is not that we should imagine ourselves as heirs to secret ancient wisdom, but that we should recognize how fragile knowledge always is, especially when it depends on continuity rather than storage. The people who lived before civilization were not waiting for history to begin. They were living fully within their own frameworks of meaning. Their worlds made sense to them. Their knowledge worked. That it did not endure in the ways we can easily measure does not make it lesser. Civilization, for all its achievements, narrowed as much as it expanded. It traded flexibility for scale. It traded memory carried in people for memory stored in things. That trade allowed growth, but it also created new vulnerabilities. The gap reminds us of that trade. As you sit with this idea, wherever you happen to be listening from, there is no need to resolve it into a neat conclusion. The past does not demand that. It asks only to be approached carefully, with patience and restraint, without forcing it into shapes it did not choose for itself. What remains when we strip away certainty is a sense of continuity that does not rely on complete knowledge, a recognition that humans have always been learning, adapting, forgetting, and inheriting long before anyone thought to write it down. Standing between what was and what we remember is not a place of failure, it is a place of perspective. It allows us to see civilization not as a sudden triumph over ignorance, but as one phase in a much longer, quieter process, one that did not begin with cities and will not end with them. And if there is a comfort in that, it lies in knowing that even when memory breaks, even when records fail, the human tendency to observe, to organize, to share, and to search for meaning does not disappear. It simply changes its form, waiting, as it always has, for the next stable moment where it can leave a mark long enough to be noticed again.